to everyone who is joining from different locations. I am Rebecca Lystrom, Communication Specialist, IFPRI-South Asia. I would like to welcome you all to the Forum on Challenges and Opportunities in Food Systems across the Eastern Gangetic Plains. This forum is organized in collaboration with International Food Policy Research Institute, Bangladesh Agriculture University Center for Green Economic Development, and Uttar Banga Krishi Vishwavidyalaya, who have worked together with the support from the Australian Centre for International Agriculture Research to map the food systems in the Eastern Gangetic Plains. Before we kickstart the session today, I would like to make a couple of housekeeping announcements to help the chairperson and panelists keep track of time and to ensure that we timely finish the session. My colleague will send you an alert in case you get close to exceeding the allocated time for your presentation. We are keen to hear from you, and especially the participants who are joining online. So you're requested to share your questions in the Q&A box, and the chairperson will take it up during the discussion session. The event is also live streamed at IFPRI-South Asia YouTube channel. So without further ado, we will now start the inaugural session, Foresight for Food Systems in the Eastern Gangetic Plains. This session will be chaired by Dr. Tamara Jackson, Program Manager, Australian Centre for International Agricultural Research, Sustainable Development Investment Portfolio. I would now like to invite Dr. Shahidul Rashid, Director, South Asia, International Food Policy Research, to give the welcome remarks. Over to you, Dr. Rashid.
Thank you, Rebecca. Madam Chair, Dr. Tamara Jackson, Dr. Eric Hartner, Program Manager at the Australian Centre for International Agriculture Research, Dr. Kuhu Joshi, Program Coordinator for South Asia. Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues from the partner organization, a very good morning to everyone joining here from South Asia. Good evening to colleagues from Washington, and good afternoon to colleagues joining from Australia, and greetings to everybody else joining from other parts of the world. It's a real pleasure that we have been able to organize such an event. This program has been going on since 2018, and if you look at the title of it, it says Foresight for the Food System in Eastern Gangetic Plain. So I thought I would put this slide here because this is a note, actually a quote from a famous development expert who wrote a book back in the 1960s. His name is Arthur Mosher. He came to India in the 1930s as a young man, right after finishing his college. He spent a few years, then went back to do a PhD in economics from the University of Chicago in the US. With a PhD in economics from University of Chicago, world was open to him, but he decided to move back to India, work in the place that we are talking about, in the Gangetic Plain. So here is what I saw in his book. While traveling through the Indo-Gangetic Plain, Arthur Mosher was once asked by a friend, the friend was from Iowa, will this place ever be as productive as Iowa? Although Mosher lived and worked in that region of India, he himself had not ever asked such a question. So he writes, too often we ask ourselves, what should we do next? We do not look far enough down the years, visualize what should ultimately happen, and then work backward to the present as well as forward from where we are in, developing our plan. So this is a quote from his book, Getting Agriculture Moving, Essentials for Development and Modernization. Why do I quote this? Because this project and the ACIAR focus has been on foresight for food system. And we need to ask some fundamental question in this context. Question number one, if we look back now and think like Mosher did, first question we have to ask is, what kind of food system do we want for our future generation? That's the fundamental first question. Second question we have to ask is, what are we doing today? What is the policy landscape? What is the agroecological condition of the Eastern Gangetic Plain that can contribute to or pose challenges to developing a sustainable food system. And the final question we ought to ask, which Arthur Moshe did not have, is what kind of tools do we have today, given this information age, which we can leverage to develop better model, better prediction, better foresight? So on the first question, what kind of food system do we want for our future generation? Answer should be obvious. We want a sustainable, resilient agri-food system for our future generation. Is that feasible given the current policy landscape, given the current agroecological condition of Eastern Gangetic Plain or South Asia in general? The answer is no. The food system we have today is not sustainable. And we don't blame our ancestors. Green revolution that came to this part of the world also has created negative externalities, challenges for our future generation. So for us, the responsibility burden is to undo some of those damages and do our best to make this food system sustainable for the future generation. The numbers are obvious. I mean, this region is facing an existential challenge. If you look at the climate change challenges, food security challenges, nutrition challenges, I think we didn't talk. Look at it. Unless South Asia achieves sustainable development goals, the world will not achieve them. From environmentally, from glacier melting to salinity intrusion to heat waves, all of these challenges are encountered by the South Asian region policymakers. So question is, how do we do that? How can we undo some of these policies, develop new set of policies that can ensure a sustainable food system for the future generation? Coming to last point, when Arthur Moshe wrote his book, he did not have even a laptop. What analysis that we can do today were just beyond imagination. As you will see today, we have some top modeling group from IFPRI will be presenting here. Kind of analysis we can do, kind of simulation, scenario analysis we can do today is unprecedented. And as partners, Australian Aid, ACIAR, and other partners, I think we should all work together to leverage this emerging modeling tool and technical tool, understand the context, integrate those constraints into the model, and generate scenarios that can ensure sustainable food system. And we have to keep at it. It is not one short thing. I mean, I'm assuming, and I appeal to my colleagues from the Australian Aid and ACIAR, this is not an event. This work is a process. We have to keep at it in the future so that we can leave a sustainable, resilient food system for our future generation. Now, on behalf of our partner, Australian Centre for International Agriculture Research, Bangladesh Agricultural University, Center for Green Economy Development Nepal, and Uttar Banga Krishi Vishwavidyalaya, I extend a very warm welcome to you all. We have a very exciting set of presentations coming up. I hope you will join us and continue to remain engaged in this dialogue. Thank you very much. I wish you all the best.
Thank you, Dr. Rashid. I would now like to invite Dr. Eric Hutner, Research Program Manager, and Dr. Kuhu Chatterjee, Program Manager from Australian Centre for International Agriculture Research. They will speak to us today on supporting foresight exercises for food systems in South Asia, ACIAR's experience. Over to you, Dr. Eric.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Dr. Shahidur, for this very uplifting introduction, which provides a perfect context for the next 2 days, and in particular, what is at stake here. Kuhu, my dear colleague, will provide you more details about how the ACIAR investment in the now finished SDIP has allowed this process of foresight to become part of the way we do things. I just want to provide a small number of comments in general. The use of foresight methods and workshop is relatively new for ACIAR, and I think the Eastern Gangetic Plains was a good spot to actually start and try the benefit of that approach. It's interesting that we have been doing it with you colleagues all present today in a sort of regional basis, but that learning that we have can be expanded globally, and I understand some broader initiatives are at play, which try to attract more funding and more intellect to the process. And I think one thing we've learned all along is that the engagement of all the people involved, the process is often as useful as the actual output, because doing the foresight exercise obliges people to think over the long term, as Arthur Mosher quoted, did not do initially. So it triggers people thinking and reflection, and that process alone is probably highly valuable. I'd like to conclude before giving the floor to Kuhu by reflecting on how much we need to be humble and modest about the process in light of shocks and disturbances that systems can throw at us at short notice. So in my time at ACIAR, I can, for example, remember some biosecurity crises that were unpredicted and unpredictable, such as the new strains UG99 of wheat rust, which suddenly became a massive potential threat for South Asia, and which we actually did manage in a manner that relied on all sorts of tools and technologies. More recently, we had the detection of wheat blast in Bangladesh, which really came out of nowhere, and people could not be prepared for this really, in the sense that it had never existed before and would have required a lot of foresight to actually be prepared for. It's interesting to reflect that about 5 years before the wheat blast was detected in Bangladesh, the CIMMYT researchers actually had some attempt to predict where such a disease could happen. And it probably helped us all to take action. Now, more recently, of course, we were all confronted with COVID-19. And it's, again, an interesting reflection on food systems that it seems that in many parts of the world, agriculture provided an actual resilient contribution to managing this unexpected shock. A lot of traditional or smallholder farming proved remarkably resilient to this disturbance in many places. But of course, the most recent thing which has taken us all by surprise is the geopolitical events happening in Europe and the war in Ukraine, which create disruptions and shockwaves of disturbances in many areas of agriculture, again, in a way that we didn't see coming, but maybe foresight exercises in the future should take into account. So just to conclude, welcome everyone to these next 2 days. And I'm now passing the floor to Kuhu. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eric. Rebecca, should I share my screen or will you?
Yes, Dr. Chatterjee, we have given you co-host. You'll be able to share your screen.
Okay, you can start the slideshow.
Yeah, my colleague has pulled it up.
From the first slide.
Ruchi, could you kindly reshare your screen again? The presentation is not there. Okay.
Can you do the slideshow, Ruchi, please? This is the second slide, I think, the first one. Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. Before I talk about the foresight exercises in our ACIAR STIP program, I would like to provide an overview of the Australian government-funded Sustainable Development Investment Portfolio, SDIP, and ACIAR's role in it. The next one, please. This overview provides the context of ACIAR's work on foresight processes. The ACIAR program was implemented in two phases, 1 and 2, from 2013 to 2021. In the first phase, which was entirely a large project on sustainable and resilient farming systems intensification, SRFSI, and that was conservation agriculture-based sustainable intensification, which was a field-based project with focus on zero-till and mechanization. In the phase 2 of the project, it was more broadly based view of opportunities and constraints for sustainable intensification of agriculture, guided by an overall 2-year work program that outlined the sequence of priority activities and tasks. The diagram shows the focus. The flexibility was built in the program design to ensure an ability to adapt and respond to emerging issues. This diagram shows the focus on the production side and supporting services in phase 1, and in phase 2 expanded to better understand the wider food system. Next one, please. This diagram in phase 1, testing and conservation agriculture-based sustainable intensification, understanding the farming system context across the EGP and local production system, understanding and promoting sustainable farming technologies based on conservation agriculture, deploying limited tillage and crop residue retention to rice-based system. A good idea, but with a slow intake. In phase 2, we incorporated the wider context of the food system and important drivers and trends. Sustainable food systems are a way of integrating different sectors at a range of scales. Promoted resilient and inclusive food systems supported by robust institutional arrangements, policies, and strategic regional planning. The program explored farming systems in the context of wider food systems and within the broader political economy. Sustainable farming system research related to conservation agriculture, mechanization, and groundwater formed the basis of the program. Foresight provided an overview. Projects used common research and development approaches. Major cross-cutting themes emerging are on the right. Next one, please. Dusty, I think we will have to go to the next one. We had to take a long-term approach to changing food systems. It was developed the processes using foresight approaches at local and regional scales to understand the kinds of long-term systems approaches that are needed to achieve food systems change. Critical mass of people interested and trained in foresight approaches, 3 regional meetings with diverse stakeholders, local level work, put together diverse information on drivers and trends, the food systems report for the 3 countries, 9 status papers to synthesize information on topics on key drivers of the food system, and multiple academic pieces. There were activities done to link local to regional level. Next one, please. The project team working on this small sub-project carried out the whole gamut of foresight exercises, focus group discussions, primary surveys, analysis of secondary data, and scenario building and trade-off analysis using complex models at different scales. Household level in West Bengal and Bangladesh, community, village level in Nepal, and national level in India. 3 key lessons from the project are: the crop and diet diversity are not monotonically increasing over time in the Eastern Gangetic Plain. The data from rural Bangladesh shows a significant decline in diet diversity between 2011 and 2015 in many parts of the country. Similarly, model predictions suggest that Indian diets in 2050 may move further away from the planetary health diet recommended by Eat Lancet. Rationalization of energy subsidies to promote sustainable water use in agriculture, less restricted food trade regime, and shift from distortionary grain subsidies to income transfers, all of recommended policy reforms, may impose significant welfare burdens on farmers who may have to be compensated to support these reforms. Conducting a participatory foresight exercise requires the development of new tools, modules, and approaches to encourage or induce farmers to share their concerns and aspirations for change over the medium and the long run. Otherwise, farmers prefer to discuss their immediate concerns, and outsiders organizations such exercises. The next one, please. We had to engage with many partners. It was 40 plus partners, multi-location. We were working in different locations. Benefit and a challenge in management from national and local research and development partners, CGED institutes like CIMIT, IFPRI, IMI, and Australian universities. New partners were required in moving from research to implementation and scaling to policy and investment with skill sets outside of agriculture. They were intentionally brought together from different discipline sectors, career stages, gender, to ensure a diverse set of experience and expertise. Capacity building and was done to build emerging researchers in partner countries. The next slide, please. The last one. Next. The key lessons from ACIAR's perspective: it was critical in enabling the program to be framed in the context of food systems and to position the work in relation to key drivers of change and in the EGP. Foresight processes can create an opportunity for learning by bringing together different views and a breadth of intellectual inquiry that can contribute to the bigger picture of challenges in the region. Integration and synthesis of existing information, coupled with scenario planning, can enhance the knowledge policy interface. The foresight work has contributed to the ACIAR STIP Phase 2 goals of developing a better understanding of the drivers and constraints that affect development of a sustainable food system in South Asia, to ultimately create a more effective enabling environment. The participatory research process in this project and its output will help ACIAR in engaging with policymakers and the private sector in the EGP region in broader discussions about future directions, especially in the context of food, energy, water nexus. For more information, you can look at the ACIAR SDIP website given on the screen. And thank you very much, and I will look forward to questions.
Dr. Hatner and Dr. Chatterjee. I would now like to turn to Dr. Avinash Kishore, Research Fellow, International Food Policy Research Institute, to share some of the salient features of the food systems in Bangladesh, India, and Nepal. Over to you, Dr. Kishore.
Thanks, Rebecca. Let me share my screen. So, sorry, I'm kind of struggling here.
It's the bottom of the page.
No, I found the link, but I'm looking for my PowerPoint slide and it won't come. Okay, just a second, yeah. Yes, I think I got there. Give me a second. Too many files open. I think that's the problem. Give me 1 second. Just a second.
I think, Dr. Kishore, you pulled up the template, not the presentation. I can see.
I agree. Yeah.
You might have to stop sharing this.
Is it now? Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can. The correct slide. Yeah.
Apologies for the thing. So thanks a lot, Kuhu, Eric, and all other participants who are in the room. This presentation, I was coordinating this project, and it has been a pleasure working on this project with a number of partners. The name here is mine, but I am only reporting back a lot of work that we did with a whole lot of partners from India and also India, Bangladesh, and Nepal. I would particularly like to thank my partners in BAU, Dr. Jahangir Alam and his team, and Dr. Madhav Karki from CGED in Nepal. They have been our partners throughout this project. I'd also like to thank Dr. Kuhu Chatterjee and Dr. Tamara Jackson for their continuous support throughout the project. What I'm going to do in my presentation, and also the way we structured this two-day webinar, is we are going to present a lot of results and findings and our own learnings in running this project. But what we decided, because the context is changing very rapidly, as Eric pointed out and in his brief remarks, we have brought in other scientists who have been, and people who are engaging in food systems dialogue, who are not necessarily a part of this project, but have keen insights to share with everyone here who attends the session. So I would think that about 60 to 70% of the content that you'll listen to over the next 2 days, or today and tomorrow, will be from partners who have done actual work under this project, but the rest would come from other people who are working on related themes. And I think as in the fitness of things, because one of the first things that we said we will be doing under this project is bringing together like-minded people or people who, with diverse views, who are working on different aspects of food systems in the same room, in the same seminar or discussion, and share what we are finding. So with that, I'll start. So we know that food systems are critical for almost all sustainable development goals. And Eastern Gangetic Plain, which includes Bihar, West Bengal, Bangladesh, and Nepal, Tarai, even more so because the dependence on agriculture is high for employment, and food is a big part of the budget. So it's critical that we engage with food systems in this region, and the goals will be achieved only if this region is there. So what we did is we used a food systems approach. You know that there are many different frameworks on how you look at food systems. So this is kind of a precursor of the HLP framework that now UN uses, but essentially it's the same. It looks at actors, activities, and outcomes. We looked at the socioeconomic drivers. I'll talk about some of them. The food chain, the food supply system itself, production to consumption and waste reduction, and the environmental drivers, including climate change and resource depletion, soil and water. Those are the center of the framework. And the idea is, how are these things interacting with each other? What are the linkages, and what is the impact on environment, on people's welfare, and particularly also their health and nutrition. So food security, environmental outcomes, and socioeconomic outcomes. That's the broad framework that we had in mind. And we were doing research or consultations. We're trying to keep in mind these things. I would be the first to admit that we couldn't cover every aspect of the food systems. There are a lot of aspects, and that's one of the lessons, is that there's some very critical components of the food systems, or these linkages shown here in the arrows, that we couldn't do justice to in this project. And in our future work on food systems, we'll flag those, and would try ourselves to work on them and encourage others with better expertise. One example that comes to the mind right away is the political economy and the compulsions that our elected leaders face in the region to structure the incentives for all the actors in the way they are. We do not like the way the incentives are structured, but there are compulsions behind, and there's a history and path dependence to where we are. And engaging with those processes, understanding those compulsions would make our research more relevant. Unfortunately, we couldn't cover that, that area in any detail or with any rigor in this project. That's one of the major limitations of this exercise that we undertook. So what was our broad approach? So essentially what we did is we tried to collate data, the most relevant, the most recent that was available, and use simple or more involved models. There is a session on modeling in the next session, and then try to use what are the results to share it with a wider group of people to generate greater interest. Another important part, building on the science, was engaging with diverse set of partners, including researchers, but also businessmen, elected leaders, farmer representatives, consumers, and scientists to think about the future and see how we can try to have a better future. Because foresight is an involved exercise and requires specific methods, etc. So in early 2019, we organized a 4-day learning workshop, widely attended by people from all sectors and disciplines, to understand what are the different processes we can follow to conduct foresight exercises, both participatory ones and the ones that you do using analytical models on your desktop. A big part of this project was mapping the food systems, learning how to do foresight, and doing foresight modeling, etc., but also engaging with farmers and farming communities in local foresight exercises. Unfortunately, COVID came in, it intervened. So we could do the participatory foresight exercises only in Nepal, in Bangladesh, and in India, in West Bengal, it was planned, but we could not do it in a participatory way. In Bangladesh, given the COVID restrictions, we could not organize, in Bangladesh and West Bengal, we could not organize participatory activities or group discussions. So what we resorted to, at least in West Bengal, is to do a primary survey, which is a poor substitute of actually sitting down with people and helping them engaging with them in understanding how they think about the future and what are their strategies to cope with it, what are their aspirations to make the most of it. One thing, as Kuhu also alluded, we learned from our exercises in Nepal that we need better skills and maybe different techniques to engage people when we are engaging with people, to help them articulate or help us understand what their aspirations of the future, their fears of the future, and their strategies of the future are. People are thinking long-term and short-term both, but when outsiders come in and interact with them, it is our experience that the discussion often ends up more about the here and now concerns. That makes sense. But if we want them to talk about longer term, I guess different kind of data, different kind of visualizations may be required. What we went with was often national or even regional level data, regional level futures and results. And probably that's not the best way to do it. So it was an important and very useful lesson in the way we conducted the local level foresight exercise with participants, or even primary surveys when we're trying to make them think about somewhat distant future, 15 years, 20 years down the line. Then the other thing was that we know that in this region, the diets are quite unhealthy. So we engaged in, at least in India, a modeling exercise where we looked at what would happen to the dietary transition if it's already happening, if we were to change the energy irrigation nexus, the way it operates, and international food trade in the region. They switch from carb-heavy diet to richer diet. What would be the outcome? And we are more interested in, okay, if we change the rationalized energy subsidies or we engage in more open trade, what would be the trade-offs? What would be the gains in terms of dietary diversity, etc.? But also what would be the challenges or what would be the limitations faced in terms of employment generation? Food systems are big employers, risks and other things. And this was done using the IFPRI's impact model. So this was another exercise we did to supplement local participatory exercise. Like I said, we had a number of partners, some who were with us throughout the project, CGED, UBKV, and BAU. There are some partners who came in with to work on specific themes where they have specializations. So Professor Sucharita Sen from JNU helped us understand the women's role in agriculture as they are. INREM Foundation worked with us on We talk about groundwater a lot, but also on water quality and what do we know about water quality and what do we not know about water quality. ICAR, NIAP, which is almost an IFPRI equivalent in the system, they helped us understand the changing energy irrigation nexus and its implications in both West Bengal and Bihar. ACIAR, of course, has been a constant supporter, both financially and in coordination, and using its factoring skills and its reputation to bring in more partners to the table. What are the core outputs, the sets of outputs? So we are very proud of the learning workshop that we organized, and most of the participants we interacted with found it quite useful. A lot of new ideas came for the second and the third stages of the project. We have published or produced more than a dozen. Some of these papers are published, some of them are publishable and are under review or are being polished for publications. Not only that, what's not listed here is a lot of these papers that we started, that this project helped us to start working on, have led us to explore new arenas and go deeper into these issues. And there are more second generation papers coming out of the exercises that we started in this short project. We also produced for wider sharing 8 status briefs on different themes related to food systems. These are less technical briefings on where we are on a number of these issues listed here. What do we know and what do we not know about some of these issues, the impact of climate change, the way energy irrigation nexus is evolving, the role of women in agriculture, water quality, and a couple of other issues. We also actively, the project, IFPRI and our partners contributed actively to the UN Summit, Food System Summit, and its national level planning and meetings that were happening. So we were linking, we're doing our own work, we're interacting in the region, but we're also constantly engaging with our global processes that were going on. Let me also in the remaining time share some of the findings that we have. Interesting findings and important that I hope would trigger some discussion and thinking about how to go about doing food systems research in this region. So if you look at the drivers, one of the most important drivers of change, not just in food systems, but overall lives, is demography. And one of the major things that's not recognized enough is the very sharp decline in fertility rates across the region. Bihar is a laggard, but even there, the recent NFHS shows very sharp decline has set in Bihar in fertility rate. And the region is quickly going below the replacement rate, especially West Bengal. If you look at TFR for Kolkata, the fertility rate is close to 1, which is almost Italian or Japanese level. So there's a demographic window, which is by which we mean it's the first time that this region is the productive age population is growing faster than the dependent population. But the window will not remain open forever. This shows it's a data from India Spend. That the window, because Bihar's fertility rate is still quite high, Bihar is at the bottom, would open for some years, another 20 years in Bihar. But in areas like West Bengal and following from there, Bangladesh is not shown here, and Nepal, the window may close pretty soon. What it requires is, this is the time to leverage this productive increase in productive population to boost economic growth. It also comes with a challenge that we need to generate jobs, okay? And that's where food economy will play a huge role for everyone, but especially for women. But when we talk of food economy, a lot of the discussion focuses mostly on what happens on farm. We did an analysis of a very large data set of food enterprises in India, and we found that the share of off-farm food enterprises, especially the post-harvest enterprises, trading, retailing, food services, food manufacture, etc., is growing rapidly. Over the last 10 years, India's food economy, the off-farm food economy, has grown at about 8%. In comparison, the on-farm food economy's growth has never exceeded 4%. So this economy is becoming important, not only in terms of its economic contribution, but also in creating jobs. It also it's one of the few sectors in the region where women have very high representation, especially the food manufacturing part. However, food enterprises have several limitations compared to other similar informal enterprises. They seem to be smaller, have poor productivity, and high vulnerability to shocks. There's also another implication that comes from this work, that we have a very large number, several tens of millions of enterprises that are small, informal, and not legible to the government or public sector. They are not registered, etc. What that means is that purely regulatory approaches to, let's say, promoting food safety or even improving business efficiency are unlikely to work. We need to combine technology-led approaches that many fintech companies are doing to lend to these enterprises who do not have balance sheets or collateral, and awareness-related approaches when we are thinking about food safety. Just regulatory approaches, just fiat would not work. And also when we're trying to bring any relief or benefit to them during shocks like COVID, there too will face challenges if we don't use technology. Changing gears, and I'll keep changing gears a lot here, is that a related problem when I'm talking about need for employment generation in this economy is that particularly in India, there's a very sharp decline, more so in Eastern India, in women's participation in labor force in general, but also their participation in agriculture. Professor Sain has done a lot of work and will talk about it in her session next, in her presentation tomorrow. They are both push and pull factors at work. And this is something on which we need more data, more recurring data to analyze it and understand it better as to why it is happening and what are its implications. The other thing which we do not talk enough about when we are talking about food systems and trying to understand how to work on it is that more and more farm households that are obvious, like registered at farm households, are diversifying to non-farm or off-farm occupations. This shows data from different countries, and much of this data is already old. So for example, in Nepal, we use NLSS data, which is more than a decade old now. So we need more recent data, but you'll see that there are very few households remaining in this region that depend purely on crop agriculture for their livelihoods and income. And it has multiple implications in the way we think about supporting farm households and even promoting sustainable technologies, etc. If a farm household thinks that its future is not in agriculture or is already not engaged in agriculture, it's probably, it's a conjecture that they may be less likely to engage in activities that are meant to ensure future security of our natural resources, etc. They would rather want to exploit the resources, generate surplus, and invest it into off-farm enterprise. That's just one implication. But there could be multiple in the way we manage this process, and we understand this process and its implications for how we govern or how we conduct our food systems. Another thing that's my pet bugbear, is a lot of food systems projects that I scan ignore food trade. Many of them even focus on how we need to become self-sufficient in producing everything from rice, wheat to pulses to fruits and vegetables, if we want to improve diets, etc. Partly our region, this whole EGP region, you'll see as compared to ASEAN, trades much less than other countries. And it's not just because we have more people per acre of land or we have more mouths to feed. Vietnam, China, etc., per person available land or average land holding sizes are even smaller in these countries, and they trade a whole lot more. They import more and they export more food. And I would go ahead and make a bold claim that we want doubling farmers' income in India and similar aggressive or ambitious goals in other parts of the EGP too. I don't think that without tapping export markets, we can achieve those goals or get anywhere near those goals. Our consumers do not have that kind of purchasing power. A related implication would be you cannot only export. If you are not importing, you are not going to be able to export either. So it's important that we talk more about trade and what trade can do to make food systems more sustainable, to make farmers richer, to make diets easy access to healthy and nutritious diets. It has its downsides too. Both needs to be engaged with. This is already known that we eat a lot of carbs and not enough of other types of food. But what is more recent in the literature is that most households in our region cannot afford what Eat Lancet or even our NIN or National Dietary Recommendations suggest. And my surmise is that this percentage would have only gone up during COVID. When there's a K-shaped recovery or there's a talk of K-shaped recovery where the poor households are not doing that well. So that's something, while we recommend diet, affording it, and then how do we make these diets more affordable? We have to think of multiple approaches, not just social safety net programs, but also trades and market-led approaches. One very important thing is most of the data that we have in this region is at the household level. We and others have looked at Bangladesh, where IFPRI collected intra-household data on food consumption, and that data is eye-opening. You know, 1/3 of poor people, poor individuals live in non-poor households in Bangladesh. And if you measure poverty only by looking at household average consumption expenditure, you will ignore half of the poor people. The poverty rate in Bangladesh would be double as high if there were ways, if we used intra-household data to estimate intra-household poverty or individual level poverty. So we underestimate poverty, we ignore a lot of malnutrition or low bargaining power, etc., when we look only at the household level data. And in the future work, and we need to create a constituency in India, in Nepal, where we focus more on collecting intra-household data too, to understand what's going on within households, what's happening to older women, also young women and children, and not the firstborn sons in the region. Those are the most suffering. And Javeria will talk tomorrow about some of our results on intra-household distribution of nutritive food in Bangladesh. There's another thing that is happening, and it's not acknowledged in many of our projects. ACIAR has been a leader in supporting and engaging with this work. Is for 40 years, farmers in entire Intergangetic plain depended on either muscle power or diesel pumps for irrigation. They're super expensive. But in just last 5-6 years, it's mind-boggling how rapidly things are changing across the region, barring, I guess, Nepal, Tarai. Farmers are switching to electric pumps. They're being connected to rural electricity grids. Power supply has improved. This has implications. Early results work again supported by ACIAR that Aditi and her group did in IMI. It shows not very discernible, easily discernible macro level impacts. There may be micro level impacts that we don't understand. And it's important that we engage in this area. We revisit the energy irrigation nexus research in this area to understand why we are not seeing as big an impact or as equitable impacts as one would expect, and what can be done in terms of energy policies, but also market support, etc., to make sure that this region, the irrigation surplus that is generated due to electrification and more affordable irrigation grows over time. We, in the last phase of this project, looked at COVID. It was hard to ignore. And we had some findings across 3 regions, Bihar, Bangladesh, and Nepal, Tarai. We have a session on it tomorrow. I invite all of you to join. Just some quick results. So as Eric also reported, said, there are very small impacts on agriculture, relatively small impacts, I would say, in the long term, especially on production. But price, farmers did suffer, at least in the beginning when the lockdown was imposed in India, for example. And in fisheries, we had organized a seminar where we learned that people growing perishable foods or people suffering from lockdown, their price realization did go down pretty significantly. But as I said, most agriculture households in the region depend on remittance and other non-agriculture sources of income. They were hurt more. So as a result, there was significant decline in household income and even consumption. Some results will be shown in tomorrow's session, that is especially on COVID, and women farmers may have faced more limitations. In India and also in Bangladesh, we know that food-based social safety net programs did help a great deal, but they did not fully compensate for the significant losses that households face. And now I think it's time to look at the resilience, like have they come back to the pre-COVID levels or have they gone beyond what their COVID levels were? And that's some of the research that IFPRI and its partners are also engaging in. My last slide on the content is that, as I said, our research on food systems, we realize that there are a number of issues that everyone recognizes. It's not that we were the first to discover them, or that they are widely recognized, but they are barely analyzed and are going to become even more important in times to come. I'm listing just 3. There are 3 of my favorites, but I'm sure more of you, as we go into the discussion, would have similar themes. So one, like I said, food enterprises. We have studied commodity value chains, but the way food enterprises are organized, most of them are not single commodity enterprises. They engage in multiple commodities and sometimes multiple activities. How do they contribute? How can we make them more vibrant? How can they engage more people into jobs that are less drudgerous than, let's say, pure farming, etc., are areas that we need to engage with and understand better. The second, as COVID made it very salient, is the food safety. And in food safety, not just the scare stories of how unsafe our food are, that's also important, but how do we make it safer? And like I said, my first cut, I'm not an expert on food, and an expert on food safety, is that purely regulatory approaches are unlikely to work. So how do we change behaviors? How do we incentivize healthy behaviors, etc. How can we make our food safer without making it more costly? So often in research that IFPRI has done, my colleague Devesh, Anjani, etc., it seems that farmers are willing to invest in safer foods only if it gets them higher prices, or that seems to be an important condition. Many consumers do not have willingness to pay higher for safer food. They cannot afford to. So how do we achieve food safety without driving prices up would be another one of the challenges. The third one that I said is, all of us know that there is occupational diversification happening, but what are its various implications? How is it happening, both for food production, but also for households, all households, farming and non-farming households, is something that is important and became even more salient during COVID when these people from farm households who had moved away to other parts of India or the world started walking back to their home, and the role of agriculture as being the sheet anchor, even in these diversified households. I think that's a theme that's exciting, interesting, and important to engage with. These are my last slides, the next steps that we are doing. And I just want to introduce a new project that 1CG is starting in this region. It covers Bangladesh, India, Nepal, but also Pakistan, on transforming agri-food systems. In a way, it kinds of builds up on this project and many other projects. Tomorrow in the leadership dialogue, Dr. Purnima Menon, who is one of the co-leads of this project, will talk in detail. I just want to leave you with this thing that we are trying to engage with the people from CIMIT and IRI who are agronomists, they're economists, political scientists also we are trying to engage, nutritionists, they're all coming together to look at the entire food system across these 4 countries in the region, and we would love to engage with you who are here in this session as we go ahead with the project. Purnima will talk more about it tomorrow. With that, I'll stop here. Thanks a lot for listening to me.
Thank you, Dr. Kishore. I would now like to remind the participants who are joining online today that we are keen to hear from you and to please share your questions and your comments in the Q&A box so that we can take it up during the discussion. I would now like to request the chairperson, Dr. Jackson, to share her remarks and post her remarks to open the session for discussion. Over to you, Dr. Jackson.
Thank you, Rebecca, and thanks to Eric, Kuhu, Avinash and Shahid for those for setting the scene for this in this first inaugural session on foresight for food systems. I'm so pleased to be here. I think it's almost 4 years to the day since we first met in Delhi to have our first meeting and to initiate the foresight work, and I think we can definitely say we've covered a lot of ground since then to the team that's been involved. I think the opening comments also really they echoed some of the reviewer comments from our program that, as Shahid said, it's really important I think foresight is a way to plan from the future. So, thinking about what we want the future to look like and then working backwards, I guess, from there, instead of just thinking about what's immediately in front of us. Because as Avinash showed in that presentation, there's a lot of challenges immediately before us. And so sometimes it's hard to look past those. And I guess that's true for all of us, whether we're researchers, policymakers, even, farmers or households. We're all trying to address the challenges that are close up, but we need to think about that in a longer term way. I think I'd also just like to thank and acknowledge Avinash's work in this package of work. It was actually a very kind of adaptable program of work, and it has definitely evolved. And I think we took the opportunity of some of the shocks. So when COVID came to our doorstep, obviously it was a challenge for the program, but it was also an opportunity to think about, what happens. These are exactly the kinds of shocks that we are thinking about when we are talking about and using the foresight process. So I think we took it was in some ways a blessing that we could adapt and we could use that as an example of a shock and look at that in a bit more detail. And I think the kind of rich collection of outputs and work that was undertaken is testament to Avinash and the wider group's enthusiasm, broad skill set, and deep understanding of food systems that we could actually work on this kind of broad portfolio. So they're kind of the main comments that I wanted to make. Rebecca, do you want me to work through the questions, or will you do that?
Dr. Jackson, there are some questions in the Q&A box, if you would like to take that, or start with some leading questions that you want to discuss with the panelists.
Yeah, I guess actually from my own perspective, I'm keen to hear from Avinash. What do you think, what have you learnt from this process that can, I think you did prioritize a couple of the next steps, but what have you learnt from the foresight process that you'll take into other projects going forward?
Thanks, Tamara. So two or three things we have pretty helpful frameworks now to look at food systems, but it's still very difficult to cover all aspects of food systems. It seems like it becomes all encompassing. So one thing is that we may need, how do I say, more parsimonious frameworks to do justice to the food systems. And second thing that I would say is that a lot of the work that I have reviewed, not only ours, but others, like I said in the beginning, is understanding the political economy and the history, the path dependence of how we arrive, because it seems a lot of changes that we want are stuck because incentives or policies that are being set have inertia. And just making recommendations to our leaders or policymakers is not enough, because they also know some of the challenge. Like free electricity is not good, is I guess known to everyone in India, but it's proving harder to change. So it's very important to situate this work in the political economic analysis. And our team didn't have like an expert in political economy, and many other teams have the same weaknesses. That's the second one. I think the third one, I am an empirical researcher, so it's always there, is that the data. We know that social scientists, there will never be enough data, but there are some pretty glaring absence of data or missing data. For example, in India, we do not know what households are consuming for last 10, 11 years. In Nepal, NLSS is now 11 years old, so we do not know what's going on intra-household and how agriculture and nutrition are connecting with each other. So Bangladesh does better, and we need to replicate Bangladesh model, let's say BIHS model, but that's very expensive. It's a Cadillac type research, as my colleague Purnima would say. So can we find out smarter ways of collecting richer data more frequently, including intra-household data and not just the household data? That's the third one. My last one that both Kuhu and I have already said is we try to engage local participants. Madhav, who is very good at it, did that. But I think like in 80s, PRAs, etc., were developed to talk about peoples of what they want and how do they want resource planning, etc. For foresight work, we may need to polish some of that work that was done in the past to develop better methodologies to engage rural households, urban households into this sort of exercise. They think about it, but how do we capture their views, their fears, their aspirations, something where I thought we were methodologically weak. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Avinash. Interesting and good summary on what we can prioritize, I guess, going into future work. There's a question about why, I guess, we're focusing on the Eastern Gangetic Plains. So Kuhu, maybe could you give a quick answer about why the focus was in that location?
Yeah, when ACIAR has been working in the region for 4 decades, and the Indian government had, during our consultations, had asked us to move to the east, and we also wanted to cover a regional program. So then we had to go to the Eastern Gangetic Basin, and we had to limit ourselves because there are resource limitations, both people and money. And we had to focus on an area where there were similarities and dissimilarities. Even they are pretty close to each other, paired borders. And the other thing I wanted to mention was that our foresight work was framed in a lens of food, energy, water, because a lot of foresight work in the world exists which works on nutrition. So we thought that the food, energy, water nexus lens also gives us a boundary within which we could work.
Thank you. Thanks, Kuhu. Thanks for that. There's a couple of questions, Avinash, about, I think, going back to Eric pointed out some of the big shocks that we've seen just in the last, 5 to 10 years. Geopolitical, different biosecurity, COVID, obviously. And current food system policies were prepared before that. So how can we reform existing either agriculture or food security policies that can kind of prepare for these kinds of shocks? What can we learn from them to reform those kinds of policies?
So we did, thanks, Tamara, we did look at the impact of COVID on farming households and other households. And we have two or three things. I do not think that it requires a full reset of the way the food system is. That is needed even for other regions. Actually, the food system in the region showed a lot of resilience, especially the supply chains to COVID. What is needed is, but the challenge was, for example, when Government of India or Government of Bangladesh announced relief schemes or compensations for affected food enterprises, for example, they quickly realized that it was not easy to identify the beneficiaries and how to reach out to them and make sure that the 10,000 rupees, which is a small amount, reaches the right people. So I think improving state capacity in identifying who are the most vulnerable people, not just on farms. In farm, at least we know who the landowners are, but also off-farm participants or non-land owning participants in the stakeholder in the food system. I think that's one thing that we need to invest in. And I see that Tushar had a question on fintech and food systems. We didn't work on fintech, but it became quite apparent that fintech and similar technology can enable that approach. The second part related to Ukraine crisis is, I made a case that we should trade more, right? But what Ukraine crisis shows that the pitfalls of trade too, right? So we had similar shocks. Many countries, the last count was 36, I think, have banned exports of food items. And in like Indonesia put some restrictions on palm oil. All three countries, their biggest food import is palm oil. Or till recently it was palm oil. Nepal, now it may be rice. So it shows the pitfalls of relying on trade. And I guess that also needs to be accounted for and strategized. That one thing that trade experts would tell you, that depending on just one market or one source always makes you vulnerable. So diversifying your countries that you are selling your produce to, but also sourcing your produce from, is something that I think that's the second thing that that comes to my mind right away. The third thing I would say is that I know that in all our research, on a lot of our research, we pan informal sector as being exploitative, as being inefficient. But at least COVID, to me, that was one of the lessons, is its nimbleness was to, like, every day vegetables were available in Delhi or in many other towns. So the nimbleness of informal sector, when we try to bring it under state purview or under state regulation, etc., or generate new farmers' enterprises of aggregates, FPOs, etc., it will be important to recognize how nimble our informal food system is and retain that nimbleness, that flexibility when we move it towards or nudge it towards formalization. These are some of the lessons that come to my mind right away. I'm sure there are others. Thank you.
Thanks, Avinash. And I guess another point I would make from yours and other people's work within SDIP and obviously outside as well, but is the fact that those policies need to be made, you know, they're all interacting, and so you can't make them in isolation. So the need for coordination between the different policies is really important, and I guess potentially makes them more resilient to and able to deal with shocks as they come to us. So there were actually two questions about fintech. So I think you've answered that one in terms of, yeah, have you done any work on formal community-based institutions and their link with food systems? You're on mute, Avinash.
we didn't work specifically on community institutions in food systems in this project, but there's a lot of work within IFPRI and other partner institutions going on food aggregates. Plus, before this project, the other projects that ACIAR SDIP supported under SURF-C that Kuhu mentioned in her opening presentation, they engaged with startups, agri startups, and not fintech, but other technology for other aspects of food systems, like someone referred to for seeds extension, etc. In this project, no, we didn't engage it, but we are flagging its potential role and importance. Thank you. Does it answer the question? Probably not. Sorry.
No, that's fine. Yes, thank you.
There's one question on imports from Nepal, Tamara.
Yep.
So Nepal
about Nepal importing a lot of its food from India. Was there any data gathered on the issue of food safety as opposed to trading within the country?
Not on food safety, but what we flagged, and I'm very happy to report that IFPRI is now starting a project on that. So Nepal imports food, fertilizers from India. A lot of it is informal. Some may call it illegal, but I wouldn't like to use that word. And we recognize that it's incredibly important for Nepal's food system in ways that it makes inputs available at cheaper prices, but it also limits the degrees of freedom that Nepali policymakers have in re-engineering their food systems. For example, if Nepal wants to reduce its fertilizer subsidy or remove it, let's say, I'm not saying it wants it, it doesn't have that option, because then all that will happen is almost all of fertilizer use will shift to informal imports from India. Similarly, for Nepali farmers, most of the inputs are more expensive than what Indian farmers pay across the border. But when it comes to the output, so they pay more for inputs, but when they go to sell their harvest, they have to compete against subsidized Indian farmers. So it limits the options of Nepali farmers and also Nepali policymakers and industries. So recognizing what is the scale of this informal trade, how can it be brought under a formal chain, what kind of processes, changing in border infrastructure and regulations, etc., can help, and how can we reduce any negative effects of subsidies in India on Nepali farmers and Nepali food system is something very important. And we already have one project where we are working with BIMSTEC that will look at it. And we are also trying to raise resources for a second project that will specifically focus on this issue. Food safety should be a part of that part of the work. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, Avinash. I've just got a final question for Kuhu and then Avinash as well. Kuhu, can you tell us what you found most exciting about this foresight process? Because it was new, I think, to you and I certainly. What were you excited about?
I think it was quite new to me, and the multidisciplinary or transdisciplinary processes was very novel and unique, and I liked it because I learned so much from other disciplines outside of agriculture. So that was one of the key lessons, and I liked working with young emerging researchers. That was important, and I was very keen on doing the exercise on the local at the village level, which unfortunately couldn't do, but I would still be interested to look at that issue in our current project and how it works. Thank you.
Thank you. And Avinash, what about you? What did you feel was exciting about this kind of series of projects?
So I think the most exciting for me was that I got to work, or at least collaborate with people on a diverse set of issues. Most projects are about one aspect, and it suits my own interest that I looked at production, but also got a chance to look at non-farm issues and as they impinge on agriculture. Most of my work in IFPRI has been on what happens to farm or in government offices as policies are being implemented, designed or implemented. In this case, we looked at other issues. I didn't mention a number of work that we started in this project with broad brush strokes, but we are now taking forward on, for example, what's happening to our diet changes and how snacks, unhealthy snacks are becoming predominant, or what's happening in intra-household thing. So the ability and the chance to work on a diverse set of issues with very, very smart collaborators and motivated collaborators was the best thing for me in this project. Thank you.
Thank you, Avinash and Kuhu, and I agree completely about that. The group that was undertaking the foresight, it was a really it was a broad group in terms of expertise, in terms of experience, different disciplines, and so that was it was an exciting thing to be part of, and it was really interesting to see how it emerged. I would like to draw this session to a close. To thank the speakers. Thank you to Shahid for welcoming us all to the IFPRI dialogue. Thanks to Kuhu and Eric from ACIAR for speaking, and to Avinash for giving us a taste of what was covered in the project and what we're going to hear about over the next couple of days. Thank you very much.
Great session.
Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Dr. Jackson, for your remarks and also for steering the engaging discussion. We will now take a short 10 minutes coffee break, and we will resume the session again at 10:20 a.m. Thank you.
Great.
Welcome back, everyone. We were taking a short break, so welcome back for joining again. Thanks for joining again. So we will now kickstart the session on modeling food systems in South Asia. This session will be chaired by Dr. Pramod Agarwal, who is BISA Regional Program Leader, International Maize and Wheat Improvement Center, CIMIT, India. It is my pleasure to now turn to Dr. David Laborde, Senior Research Fellow, International Food Policy Research Institute. Thank you, Dr. Laborde, for joining very early hours from DC. Over to you, Dr. Laborde.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the invitation. And yes, let me share my presentation. I'm going to talk today about the situation on world markets, in particular as a response to the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, and what it means for global food security, but also for South Asia, and in particular for Bangladesh, India, and Nepal. Just to make sure that we all share the same starting point, we had this rising food prices even before the invasion. And why there is a global concern about the current situation is, in real terms, we are back to the very high level of the 70s. And I will refer at one point about previous food crises, a bit about 2011-12 or 2007-2008. But at a global scale, and when you think about the driver at stake, we are much more in the 70s situation than in a 2000 situation. And of course, food prices is just one element in the equation of food insecurity. But also before the invasion, we had about 200 million people globally that were in severe food insecurity. So a number that are just rising year after year after year since 2015. And there are three key drivers in this, the three C's. The conflict, so both local conflict, think about Yemen, or Syria or Ethiopia, and right now what I will say a global conflict like Ukraine, due to the different countries involved and the role of this country on global food market. But we also had a number of climate shock that are actually significantly weaken the capacity of the global food system to tackle this current crisis. We are entering in the second year of La Nina that have an impact both in Latin America, where production of soybean was done last year by more than 30 million tons, but also, of course, as you know, the heat wave that has impacted South Asia. And last but not least, we are just recovering from the COVID-19 situation that was discussed in earlier presentation and will be part of the discussion of today and tomorrow. But as really, depending where you are in the world, as impoverished a number of households, but also have reduced the fiscal space of many countries and many low and middle income countries that have to borrow money to go through the crisis, and now are literally and figuratively short of fuel to go through this crisis. I am just putting on the screen, three resources that we have at IFPRI that can tackle all of this. Of course, of COVID-19, we had a number of research done, and some of it have been gathered in ebooks. On climate change, you have the last global food policy report that is really dedicated to the topic. And on the situation in Ukraine, we have a series of blogs that tackle some of the global issues, but also what it means at a country level. We have more than 20 blogs since the invasion right now, and based on the ever-evolving situation, I invite you to look at this. A lot of what I'm going to talk about is actually based on this. So in order to really grasp the seriousness of the crisis and what is going on, I'm going to cover 4 points. So first, the drivers in terms of what's happened on food markets, and that will cover both grains and vegetable oil, what's happened on fertilizer and energy market, how it leads to different country vulnerability in the world, and of course, the policy responses that are quite critical in this, and at the end will determine how drastic the consequence of what's happened on world market will be for local population, in particular the most vulnerable ones. And I will add a few conclusions about some lessons we can already draw in order to be ready to tackle the next crisis in a much better way. So on food and grain markets, as you have heard, I think 12% of the calories that are traded globally come from Ukraine or the Russian Federation. That's based on data set that we have developed at IFPRI over the years, and this has been widely used globally. Of course, people have focused on wheat, where these two countries also represent 1/3 of what is traded globally. There is a difference between what is traded globally and what is produced globally, of course. Just think about China or India that are large wheat producers, but interact very weakly with global markets. But for many food importing countries in the world, what matters is not what is produced globally, is what is available on global markets, and that's what this number actually matters. But the key message here is not just about wheat. We have impact on the vegetable oil market with sunflower oil, but also on barley and maize. And barley and maize are key feed product. And so the livestock sectors, even if we don't really talk about it in the news today, is already struggling in many places to deal with that, the shortage of feed and at least increase of price of feed. And when I say that it's not just about wheat, here you see on the left-hand side the evolution of the price of corn in orange, wheat in blue, and soybean in green. The dotted line are the historical high level from the 2007-8 food crisis. And as you see, corn is at this historical high level. Soybean is at the historical level and was rising before the crisis. And wheat have just been during a few days at an historical level. And as you can see on the right-hand side of the screen in red, here wheat is just, going back and down, back and forth, depending on the news. The invasion was the first peak. A second peak was driven by the USDA estimates for US wheat production. And the third one was when India has announced that instead of supplying the world market, they will put an export ban on wheat. So really, how sensitive is the market to this different type of shock? But it's not just about wheat. And big aspect of it is what's happened on vegetable oil, where you see that for different type of oils, price have increased. We have been even in the situation where the price of palm oil in green has been above the price of soybean oil during a few weeks. That's very rare situation. And here also that will be linked to the export ban of Indonesia. We'll come back to it. But vegetables are expensive, and in particular for most of the South Asian countries we're interested in, that's where a lot of trouble can come from. And also that's where actually various policies are creating this situation, including the biofuel policies from Indonesia to the US going through the European Union. Now, let me move to the energy and fertilizer markets. Here on this slide, you also see the evolution of food prices. Actually, it's grain prices on world price on world markets. On a black line is energy, and in green it's fertilizer. As you know, they tend to move together, and that's what they do. We are right now in a situation where they are very high, but they are still not as high, at least for energy price and fertilizer price, as in 2008 situation. But something that is very important to look at, in particular on the green line here, is fertilizer tend to overreact on world markets compared to food prices, and it means that farmer margin in many places are shrinking. Now, if you want to go back to a more stable situation on food markets, we need to have a supply response, and so farmers producing more. But if their production cost increase faster than the prices, we are not going to go back to balancing supply and demand very quickly. And that's actually the situation that we face on the rice markets, because as you have seen before, for other commodities, the price of output has increased, maybe not as much as the price of inputs, but because your fertilizer price is just a part of your total output price, you can still have positive margin. For rice, the situation right now is much more delicate. Now, most of the countries in the world actually import their fertilizer. And here you see on this map the ratio between how much we import compared to how much you use. For nitrogenous fertilizer, actually, South Asian countries, except Nepal, have relatively low level of dependency, but you need still fossil fuel to produce this nitrogen fertilizer. So here you just have to think that you should not be lured by an illusion of self-sufficiency if you still rely on importing natural gas or on coal to produce your nitrogen fertilizer. So that's where also thinking about food system as a whole and understanding all the interaction matters. Now for phosphate, we have a bit more differences across countries in the region, but for K, basically all countries need to import their potash, and that's what is going to be pretty important, because on this slide, as you can see, for nitrogenous, phosphate, and potash, you see the global market share of the different products. So nitrogenous is relatively more diversified, mainly because many countries import the fossil fuel, process their nitrogenous fertilizer, and re-export, in some case, nitrogenous fertilizer. So much more integrated market, if you want, but still dependent on fossil fuel. On phosphate, that's where we start to see higher concentration, mainly because you need to have local source of phosphate, in particular mines of phosphate, phosphatic rock to produce it. And so you see the big role of China and Morocco, but also about the Russian Federation in red, 14%. But for potash, the situation is even more extreme. Just to summarize the situation on potash, 80% of the potash is traded globally. And among this 80%, you have 75% that just come from 3 countries, Canada, Belarus, and Russia. And of course, Belarus and Russia are right now in the middle of the storm, and that leads to a very challenging situation for supplying potash. And both Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and India really depend on this 2 countries, Belarus and the Russian Federation, to get access to their potash. So of course, on the very short run, you may reduce the use of potash without seeing a direct impact on yield, but in terms of soil health and overall stability of your agriculture, that's pretty bad. So that you see something that is people are really cautious. Of course, the region itself is not as exposed as other parts of the world, in particular Western and Central Africa, or some countries in Latin America, but you may understand where the concern comes from. So when we start to combine all of that, where we get to. First, you have initially, even without this invasion, food prices were rising. As we have seen, it was true on world market. It's also true on domestic market. Here you see the food price inflation around the world on this heat map. You see significant differences from one country to another because local condition matters. But that will also be why policymakers are really focusing the situation on this, because the loss of purchasing power by their population is of concern, in particular by the poorest people that spend most of their money on food product. And in this context, we are going to see some policy implemented to deal with that. And I will say a good policy is a safety net, but it costs money. A bad policy is an export restriction because it doesn't cost money for the government on the spot, but will have consequences both for farmers and actually other food producers. And that's why I'm bringing here the question of export restriction. That's something also we track in detail at IFPRI. On the left-hand side of this screen, you see in terms of global share of calories that are impacted by one type or another of export restriction, because export restriction can take place different shape if you want. Some are about increasing export taxes, some about licensing, domestic sale, export quota, and up to the export ban. And right now we have more than 16% of the world calories that are world traded calories that are impacted by one restriction or another. And that's already higher level than what we have seen in previous crises, both in COVID-19, where We had seen a wave of export restriction, but they have been phased out relatively quickly as soon as May 2020. During the food price crisis, similarly, we have seen a spike and then some countries phasing out. Right now, with the situation in Ukraine, what we have seen is more policy put in place. Some have been softened, like the situation for Indonesia, where we have moved to restriction, complete export ban, and go back to some level of restriction, but it's still not far from being the type of freedom of trade and export that we had even a few years ago before this type of crisis. But we also have a situation on fertilizer when, for example, China has implemented very high restriction in fertilizer since the fall of last year, with important impact on the phosphate market and nitrogenous fertilizer. Now, if I just focus on food, here I want to show you a map where you will see the amount, the share, sorry, of imported calories that have been impacted by this measure. And you can see how India is represented on this map. And why is that? Is because India over time has become actually a net food exporter, and the food products that has been imported are relatively limited. But there is one major import product, that is vegetable oil, among which crude palm oil. And it means that in terms of external exposure, the only product that actually India is bringing from outside at a large scale is palm oil, and it has been targeted by Indonesia. And here I'm just going to make a parenthesis in terms of policy thinking, because when Indonesia started to put this export restriction, the first response of India and the Indian government was, it's totally unfair. You cannot deal with your trade partners like that. We had the ASEAN negotiation. We have done a lot of things. You should not behave like this. And they called their counterparts in Indonesia. And the first announcement was on a Friday in Indonesia. And on the Monday morning in Indonesia, there was an announcement saying, oh, we are going to exclude crude palm oil from the export ban to please India. But 6 hours after, Indonesia changed its mind. Now, 2 months later, you see that India has relatively bad news for the wheat harvest, and the response is we put an export ban without really having the same thinking about what will be the consequences for other countries, even if they say, oh, we are going to continue to have government-to-government deals. But that's really, all this problem about this type of selfish policy and bigger than neighbor. When they impact you, you are not happy. But when you apply them, you care not so much about the damage you can do to your fellow trading partners. Just because I'm going to move to relatively to my policy conclusion, I just want to say that we have the food prices that increase, we have the oil prices that increase, we also have the cotton prices that increase. So for some countries, that's good. For other countries like Bangladesh, actually that's not great, because Bangladesh needs cotton for its textile and wearing apparel industry, and therefore they face higher cost. So you really need to combine all of that and the type of competition we do. So here on the map, you see when you put all of this together, what it means for your current account. And here it's a net import cost. So if it is positive, it means that you have to spend more money on the world market than you will get due to the price change, and vice versa. So typically oil producers today are relatively happy, but oil importer and importer of most other commodities are less happy. But that puts really an external constraint. And if you think about Sri Lanka, you understand what an external constraint means on your economy. Couple of examples here about Bangladesh, and we have a blog on it, and you can look at it in detail. But Bangladesh capture a lot of the challenges that are taking place here, meaning that in the recent years, Russia and Ukraine have become important wheat suppliers, and have replaced for some years the role that India had. So they are exposed by that and the war, and they need to find alternative. But they have also increased significantly their vegetable oil import over time, a bit coming from Argentina through soybean oil, but a lot coming from palm oil from Indonesia. And because both Argentina and Indonesia are countries that are used to put this export restriction, you see how trading with some of these countries can expose you to the turmoil you may be in. Now, that all of this has a cost, and of course for Bangladesh, there is an external cost, as we have said, with an increase of the import bill for food and fertilizer that was already taking place before the crisis, but now is increasing. Public food distribution will be impacted by the increase of price of wheat, but we are really focusing on the rice market these days because if the rice prices go up and go up fast, many consumers and government will be in trouble and the fiscal cost will be higher. But also fertilizer subsidies in Bangladesh represent now a significant share of the public expenditure. And as early as February, they were already basically tripling the budget allocation for the fertilizer subsidy, reaching more than $4 billion. So you see how all of this can really put pressure on the fiscal base of country. When you combine all of that, you get this type of map. And so for us, clearly in Bangladesh has very high vulnerability compared to other countries in the region, but they are not the highest vulnerability in the world. If you have questions, I can go back to this. I just now want to conclude. Policy response matter, obviously. And what we see that you have a mix of good policy and bad policy implemented. So currently in the world, you have some policies that are making things worse, and you have some policies that try to make things better. Some are about a global agenda, and obviously there is a number of humanitarian operations that need more money today because the price of food is better. We need to have very well-targeted social safety net. The situation on the vegetable oil sectors cannot be separated from what's going on biofuel, in particular biodiesel. Just keep in mind that this year, 46% of the soybean oil produced in the US is going to be used to produce biodiesel in the US, and it's a purely driven policy target. Same thing in Indonesia with palm oil. If Indonesia put in place its first export restriction and then its export ban, is because they didn't want to touch their blending mandate, saying that 30% of the fuel used in Indonesia should come from palm oil, and there is a choice. And at the same time, we have seen a bit of panic buying, we have seen an export restriction, but we also see a bit of micromanaging about what farmers should do. So instead of saying, maybe we should use less fertilizer this year in some places, or maybe we want to use some crops that will be less fertilizer intensive, we have seen countries saying, oh, no, we are going to subsidize more fertilizer use, or we are going to subsidize more wheat, when potentially, once again, other crops, in particular in Africa or in North Africa, like sorghum, can be a better choice. But sometimes government doesn't try to really ride the wave of the shock and try to fight the current, and they spend a lot of money doing that. And just to conclude my 4 points, the previous slide was a kind of, what you do during this emergency, what you should do and what you should not do because you don't want to do harms. But there is more long-term elements to keep in mind. How we produce food. Currently, there is, in some places, an overuse of fertilizer due to high subsidies. And we also use fertilizer that are pretty old in terms of how you make them, but also how you apply them. So there is a need of innovation and knowledge in the sector. Then we have the question of subsidies. Of course, in the middle of the crisis, I'm not going to argue about removing all of these subsidies, but in period of quiet markets, that's where we need to do reform, because otherwise at each crisis, we spend more and more money, including to just double down on bad specialization. And that's a kind of vicious circle when this money could be basically invested in more long-term action that will make the system more resilient. It doesn't require to just open the gate of subsidies every time there is a shock. Then what we do with our land is important. So the discussion about food, feed, biofuel, and ecosystem services, it has to be key, and we don't want to sacrifice long-term sustainability just also to say, oh, we need to produce more food during a couple of years. And then I will say that we really need to have more information for policymakers in order that they make the right decision, and that they also think about country cooperation, some at the global scale with, for example, AMIS and what the G20 is doing, but obviously also at the regional level in order to not see this beggar than neighbor policy. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Labart, for the comments and insights. I would now like to invite Dr. Devesh Roy, Senior Research Fellow, International Food Policy Research Institute. Today, he will be sharing with us the interlinkages between agriculture, environment, trade, and human welfare in South and Southeast Asia. Over to you, Dr. Roy.
Was muted, just 1 second.
Dr. Roy, would you want us to pull up your presentation?
No, I think I can do this.
Okay.
Can you see it now?
Yes, we can see it. Thank you.
Okay, so and, okay, so I just need to put it on the slideshow, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's there on the
All
top.
right, here. Now is it okay?
Yes, it's okay now. Thank you.
Okay, so thanks. I was just listening to David's presentation. So it was, we just a lot of insights on how these things are going to work in kind of in a system way. And this looking at from point of looking at, things of where environment will come in, where sustainability would come in, and the trade economy. So my presentation is more on the conceptual linkages that when we are going to look at, you look at agriculture, you look at climate, but you look at economy, and you have to look at is the nexus that, how these things are linked in and in bringing out the outcomes. And, that includes some of the shocks that could be there. Russia, Ukraine, that was there present now could be one of the shocks, but there's a gamut of shock that can happen, and how do you cope with it? They're all based on these linkages, which we call as, I've just put nutrition there, but it could be welfare. That is to look at this agriculture, climate, economy nexus. And this could apply anywhere, but we just specifically also we contextualize for these countries in the Gangetic Basin, right? So just setting at the stage that, these are why these linkages matter and how they would affect outcomes. So there it's kind of really probably the highest density of rural poor in the world. So that's why when I say about economy, when you're looking at economy also meet from a development perspective that, what we are talking about as agriculture, climate, and the economy linkage. That includes the development side of it, where there is a high incidence of poverty. All these three countries, even though Bangladesh has been surging ahead with a lot of economic growth and so on, but at the current situation, you still have poverty, even the simple headcount ratios loitering around over 20%. So, and it's also a region which is very sustainable, very vulnerable to the climate change because there is a high dependence on agriculture. And as you said, is that characterized by world's highest density of rural poor. The yield gaps, the agriculture productivity is low, there's limited crop diversification. But there is also very highly fertile land, so which is, it also gives you the constraint and opportunities for. So this is now why this vulnerability. I mean, with economic outcomes, apart from the climate-related outcomes, they could also be a one big factor in terms of bringing about migration, which would be, with the smallholder farming systems, low productivity yields and variability. And this, one of the things which could also have been shown for Eastern Gangetic basins, that this could also be differentiated by gender and, on social groups of how the migration could be affected if, the economic outcomes or, climate related effects take place in the region. So So you just, apart from these economic shocks, climate change, there's another element, which is either, right now we just talk about the Russia-Ukraine conflict, but there are also some conflicts that could be embedded in the region itself. And that these things could all interact, and you have to look at it as a system. And we are not going to talk about, the quintessential food system that we talk about all the time. It will be food system, economic systems, and all, the political system, the security systems, all these things that will combine together in order to bring about the outcomes. And that's the idea of the conceptual framework. And so just a bit of a data that, look at climate vulnerability. These are, if you look at India, Bangladesh, Nepal, I mean, leave aside, don't know the basin part, but there have been high increase in greenhouse gas emissions here. There have been some extreme weather events. That density is also there with, cyclones and, droughts, floods, and so on. And as we said, that there are also, at a disaggregated level, you have very differentiated vulnerability that, you could affect all your development goals, including sustainable development goals that you have for this region. So what are we saying, that how do you going to look at it from as a system perspective, that, what are these linkages? So if you just put it into three heads, and that's what we say, that, you're going to get, if you want to assess the whole development outcome, we club them into three linkages that will be there among these countries and other countries outside from, is what we call as the economic linkage. Then there is a climate environment linkage, and there is what we will call a social linkage. That includes, ideas of poverty alleviation, food and nutrition, security and nutrition, issues like gender empowerment, public health, and so on. All these things are social linkages. Economic linkages will be your trade, investment, and transport, communication, and a lot of economic activities related to fisheries, livestock. And climate is basically, we know that what is going to happen because of climate change, and this is related to energy use, water use, land use, greenhouse gas emissions, and particularly also disaster management. So when we want to look at the linkages and think of what will the outcome be, we have to realize that all these linkages are themselves have relationships, and these are bi-directional relationships. So what happens in economy, that, if your trade goes up, then the composition of trade, that also changes. Then there's going to be effect on environment, on climate change, and so on. And whatever happens on climate and environment will have an effect on what happens in the economy. Same way in the social, trade and poverty, trade and inequality, there is a vast body of literature that is there. And those are those linkages that you get from trade, investment, and you can take any of those linkages. Now, if you look at, for things in the economic linkage and the climate linkage, whatever happens, economists have looked at it, and what we say has kind of, which are the scale effect, the composition effect, and technique effect. Suppose the countries in this region scale up their trade, but in terms of if the scale of trade goes up, there would be an environmental effect. But also it depends on the composition of and then it also depends on the technique, that, if you're going to produce more, what technique are you going to use? So how much of this, equipment, machineries, technology, inputs, exchange takes place would have whatever bearing on what the outcomes would be. And all these linkages, and you see we have put it as the green and red, which that means they're all both positive and negative feedback loops. And on the right, you can see about the elements of what are those linkages. And now all these linkages are kind of located in what we'll call as an enabling environment, where all your, David was talking about these, your subsidies, the domestic policies, the industrial policies, then it can be bilateral and multilateral trade negotiations. So whatever these linkages, they are all located in what we are calling an enabling environment. That could be subnational, national, international, global, and within which all the linkages play out. I mean, whatever you do on your trade liberalization, for instance, certain commodities could be really well undone by what your domestic policies are going to do. And similarly, if you look at from the social linkages, there are a lot of what, the trade economists would think about as, in a very quintessential way, what we call as the Stolper-Samuelson effect. That, what happens whether you're trading in labor-intensive commodities or, capital-intensive commodities, and that has an effect on factor returns and so on. So these are all the pathways that, we can really look at. But this is how, when you're talking about, you just have to look at this tripod and you just have to understand that how these relationships play out. So if you look at say in South Asia, say ASEAN countries, so India and Thailand, for instance, would be the most important traders. But if our imports, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Myanmar would be very important as importer. And other reality that all these countries have a very low share of kind of intra-regional trade. So there's, if you want to go for what will, as this expansion takes place, there's a lot of changes. You want to think on the scale effect, the composition effect and technique effect, because the level of trade, what the trade economy has got is really trading below potential. So there are a lot of negotiations. India itself is part of 23 or 28 agreements. Nepal is only part of 3 agreements, but there's what Jagdish Bhagwati calls a spaghetti bowl of trading arrangements. And Thailand itself is like about 22 agreements. So with all this spaghetti whole, a lot of these effects will play out on the trade and investment arrangement that will be there. If you look at, in one of the reasons that you have China, where, the things take place, and that's why it's the powerhouse of global trade. Things move much more quickly when you just compare with India. Just for signing an agreement with ASEAN, it started in 2008. In 2019, it's not still yet complete. In 2010, around the same time, it started with China, and in 2010, it was all done. So what I'm saying that whatever effects we are talking about will probably have at a much slower pace. And this is the way this, the trade has been going, and trade and investment arrangements have been going up in the region at the pace at which differential pace that they have been happening. So we just have to say, give a little bit of what, we have been working at. If we were looking at all the issues that are there in terms of regional trading, about the economic linkages, social linkages, and the climate linkages. So, India be probably one of the biggest trading arrangement that will come in the region, which is RCEP, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. India at the very last moment just dropped out of it. Similarly, there is this South Asia and part of Southeast Asia, and only part of South Asia, which is BIMSTEC, where we have been working, IFPRI has been working, and we started the work on it. We have always tried to, BIMSTEC has been really performing under potential. So our idea is that, these countries here, they have to now not look east, act east, as India has been proposing. It has also, for all these reasons, they have to kind of think big and act big. That, what David was mentioning is, India is probably the most unreliable trading partner in the world when it comes to any commodity, but particularly for agriculture, because India is highly conservative on agriculture. Right now, with the wheat export ban, same thing happens in onions and so on. And that is, so, last bit, I just conclude that, about these other linkages. One is your trade linkage. Even if you look at trade and the climate linkages, then trade always has an effect on energy use, land use, water use, greenhouse gas emissions, and it also has linkage with poverty, and poverty itself then feedbacks into what you're going to trade. So, and there are all these things in the region, which is in all these EGP countries, if you go and look at the amount of green trade that is there, or trade in green products or in technology, it's really minuscule. So that is why you just probably need to think about what of all those linkages that we have talked about in terms of, and that forms the basis of your area that we're saying what is missing here. That includes all the areas of cooperation, taking into account all those linkages that are there for understanding what the outcomes will be from on the front of agriculture, environment, climate. A lot of, and in the enabling environment, you probably need a lot of cooperation on the domestic policies, on subsidies, on taxes, on green procurement, a huge amount of action needed on the fossil fuel subsidy, and then linking up it into the international cooperation on the climate change goal. So, I mean, I'm not going to just get into the details of this, but these are all about, when you look at all these linkages and try to say what will be the policy recommendation that you can make. And these are the things that, even if you're looking at from the environmental linkages, trade linkages, there's a lot that needs to be done on cooperation, on certification, grading, labeling, and then we can really have win-win situation, because it's going to be a big source of value creation. And these are the areas of cooperation I'm not going to, and these are really getting into the granular level of how this cooperation can work, taking into account all these linkages that we are talking about, which are all bidirectional linkages. So these are all areas of cooperation. I'll not get into this. And just last bit, that we should also realize that the trade investment, it has the income distribution effect, which I said that has been covered to a very large scale. But it can also trade always, with all the revolution that Dave Donaldson and other people have brought into the literature, that trade can bring volatility and risk, and then that brings entrepreneurship, and that affects trade performance. And we know how those things work out. And so I'll stop there. And this is what we wanted to say about all this linkage. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Roy, for sharing your presentation. I would now like to invite Vartika Singh, who is a PhD candidate at the Humboldt University, to share her presentation on water resources modeling for India. Over to you, Vartika.
Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone joining here. I am glad to be present here to actually share some of the work that I have been doing as part of my PhD research here. Let me just start the slideshow. Do you see the slides now?
Yes, we can see the slide.
Thank you. So I'm going to share some of the work that I've been doing around water use and crop production in India, trying to evaluate policy options using an integrated assessment modeling approach. I initiated this work with small support from the ACIAR program, but it has been majorly funded by the Food and Land Use Coalition, as well as the People Consortium, under which my PhD program is also structured. To give somewhat of a background policy context, and a lot of this has been discussed, and most of you are experts here, would know that India's agricultural production is resource intensive and cereal centric. So there's use of a lot of water for agricultural production, but also inputs in distortionary manners, mostly due to distortionary subsidies, both for energy, nitrogen use, and a lot of other support. So power subsidies in India in 2015 and 16 were about $12 billion US, about $2 billion of which were for irrigation purposes for agricultural production in India.
Vartika, sorry interrupting you. We can't see the full screen of your slides. So it's appearing in a small window. And I see your side notes also. Is that deliberate?
No.
Yes,
do you see the full screen now? Okay.
Yes, we can now see the full screen. Thank you, Dr. Kishore, for intervening. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so now this helps to see the figures better. So you see the figure on the right, which kind of demonstrates the increase in
please go ahead. Yeah.
areas under rice and wheat from 1960s onwards to 2010. I still have to update the figure with more incoming data. But the idea is that both rice and wheat production saw an exponential increase in irrigated production, largely powered through high energy subsidies, in the sense that some states have almost zero prices for energy use for irrigation, also resulting in major of groundwater units either in critical or overexploited state, mostly in the northwest of the country. So a large set of policy discussion is around how to reduce this extensive water withdrawals for irrigation purposes. And across the world and in the emerging literature, a lot of discussion has happened around reduction of subsidies. Do we reduce the energy subsidies so farmers pay somewhat of a marginal cost of obtaining the energy for irrigation, or do we impose physical restrictions? And there have been findings from the global literature about how either of these policies have succeeded and to what extent. So I use this framework actually in an integrated assessment approach, where I try to understand what are the implications of water saving policies, either price or quantity reductions on agricultural production, water use, and food security. And to use this and to answer this question, I use an integrated assessment modeling approach, where I use this model of agricultural production and its impact on the environment. It's called MACPI. This model essentially allows us to use both biophysical factors and environmental factors together with exogenous drivers of population, economic growth reflected in terms of GDP, climate change scenarios as well, to bring it all together and help us answer questions with regards to what would be the implications of changes in one factor on the larger set of outcomes. As you see this figure on the right, this kind of tells what are the drivers in the model. So population GDP scenarios, as I talked about, and then we have the embedded in the model is socioeconomic data as well as biophysical and climate data. This all comes together in the model optimization scenario, where the objective function is to actually fulfill demand for crop, livestock, and material products at minimum costs. Also, there are several constraints implemented. So, for example, we can limit the expansion of cropland to a certain extent. We can restrict physical water withdrawals through the enforcement of environmental flow protection policies that I do, and I will shortly present the results of the same. Since the model is at a spatial level of 0.5 degrees resolution, this allows us to also understand spatial heterogeneity in crop production and yields, and also implement our policy scenarios. Yes, so the model operates on a recursive dynamic structure where cost minimization happens at 5 to 20-year time steps. I currently use a 5-year time step range. So the outcomes of our model at the end of one time step actually feed as inputs for the next time step, allowing us to run the model iteratively up until 2100, but we only restrict our analysis up until 2050 because that's somewhat easier to comprehend and understand. We also look at different spatial layers, global and regional, and India is a separate region in the model that allows us to do this analysis only for India, also accounting for other regions and interregional trade dynamics, which are also a major determinant factor in all optimization decision-making of the model. And the added advantage is that we are able to do biophysical and economic side. And I will also show later briefly how we are able to account for food demand and changing demand scenarios such as the Eat-Lancet dietary recommendations as well. So to test the water policies, which I briefly described before, I run a set of scenarios. So my baseline, we have the base irrigation water pumping cost reflected in USD per meter cube, which is 0.5 cents. And then we don't do any physical water enforcement restrictions, so no environmental flow protection policies, and we call it the baseline. Then I run two sets of price effects, whereby I incrementally increase the irrigation water pumping costs. In one scenario, I double, which is equivalent to 1 cent per cubic meter. This has been transformed because in India we have flat rate pricing in kilowatts per hour. So I've transformed these to reflect in prices per meter cube because these are the globally accepted values. And then in my first scenario, I say pumping cost prices are equivalent to the highest price of energy across all states from India. To just take an example, to demonstrate that if we were to switch to the highest price of energy charged in one state, what would the implications for the entire agro production scenario be like? And then I also be a little more ambitious to demonstrate what if we were to double, because the actual cost of energy supply is also much higher, and what would be the implications of those. Complementarily, as I said, we want to also evaluate if we were to, because a policy that reduces subsidies may not have enough political traction. I also try to demonstrate if we were to impose physical restrictions by implementing environmental flow protection policies in line with existing literature that suggests that about 40–50% of water can be restricted for agricultural users and not more than that. So I restrict water use for agriculture by 50% and 60% in the two quantity effect scenarios. And then I try to evaluate the synergies and trade-offs between these two policies. To demonstrate the first thing, this is both a result and also by design. This happens at agricultural water use. So if you look at this peach pinkish line here, this is the baseline. And this green line that goes all the way to almost like 400 cubic meters by 2030, this is the higher cost scenario. And the magenta line, this is the higher environmental flow protection policy scenario. They have been designed also in a way that by 2050, our goal is water reduction. And both of these policies actually give us the same, almost similar water reduction by 2050. So, if the goal is water reduction overall, then both of these policies will help us achieve that by 2050. But the pathways that these two policies take are very different. As you can see, that the green line, this is the high price scenario. We see a large decline in water use, agricultural water use, more than 50%. By 2030, this is a large shock that the model gets. And then it somewhat stabilizes to also eventually increase by 2050. Whereas in the environmental flow protection policy scenario, where we impose physical water restrictions, the decline is gradual, is not as steep. And by 2050, we see this change, which is also equivalent to the price effect. So we find that water use is highly sensitive to pricing policies in the short run, as I also demonstrate through other indicators that I look at. This is a map where we demonstrate, so the top left is irrigated rice areas in the current. So this is at 0.5 degree spatial resolution, and the values are in million hectares. So you may still see somewhat lighter values here. But the idea is that these other regions have higher irrigated rice production as compared to the Eastern Gangetic Plains, which is why we see the transformation across policies. So the middle ones are when we have physical water restrictions, which is environmental flow protection policies. We see that irrigated rice production completely shifts by 2050. There's some shift to the northeastern regions, but overall, but that is also very little. The same is for wheat here in the second column bottom figure, where some production shifts in the northeast, but overall there's a huge reduction. And the right figures are for the price scenarios, the higher price scenarios. I also show only the extreme scenarios here because there's not too much variation, at least in the spatial level here, where we find that overall, uniform reduction in irrigated croplands across the country for both the scenarios are observed. Then we look at a few important indicators that we're also able to see here, which is water use, as I've also demonstrated before. We look at net trade of crops. So we see that in fact, the country becomes net importer by a lot in 2030 when we have the higher price scenario. But by 2050, I should have done that before. Yeah, you see my mouse as well? Yeah. So by 2050, the net rate, the difference in trade between 2020 and 2050 is almost minimized. So this price policy is also eventually gives us the same value of trade by 2050 as in 2020. But in the short run, there is a huge impact in terms of imports and we have and I've seen the similar trend for cereal crop imports as well. Sorry, 1 second. Then we look at prices. I will also show briefly how food prices are affected because we are able to look at food price index, where we see there's a huge increase in food prices in the short run in 2030 because of the price scenario, which is the reduction in subsidies. But by 2050, prices also stabilize, not too different from the baseline. So there's also, I mean, there's still somewhat higher, but again, not too different from the baseline. And this one scenario that I don't focus on now, but I will show in the next result is the cost 1 cent scenario, where we're just doubling the energy prices, which are the values of 2005, and also values of the highest energy prices of any state in India for 2015 and 2016 to show that there is not too much variation as compared to the baseline overall. I will not show in detail too much about the cereal production. I have cereal cropland, irrigated cropland, only to show you the panel E, which is the bottom left, which is irrigated cropland rice. So if you see in 2030, irrigated rice production falls by a lot. This is in million hectares, but it's only about 2-3 million hectares that we see in the model. There's some recovery by 2050, but again, not too much. But for wheat in the price scenario, that is not as much of a change. But if you look at this pink line, this is the doubling of current prices. We are able to show that rice production declines. But again, the decline is not as distortionary as the higher price scenario. And same for the environmental flow protection policy scenarios as well. We look at the food price index here, and the green is the baseline here, and we are able to show that food prices will be higher when we implement either of these, either the price effects or the quantity policies. Food prices will be higher, but there is again a choice that one can make between how much further you want to allow for food prices to be higher. So the price policy has larger short-term effects than the physical water restriction policies. I want to also take the time, since there was quite a lot of discussion around the impact of diets. So in this model, we are also able to evaluate, not for the current water exercise, but we have done this separately to look at the impact of Eat Lancet dietary recommendations across different scenarios. And I don't specify, because in this presentation, I'm unable to specify all the details of the scenarios and assumptions made, but we are able to demonstrate the changes in food consumption because of Eat Lancet dietary recommendations. And we are able to see that by 2050, if we switch to Eat Lancet dietary recommendations, there's changes in pulses, fruits, and vegetables consumption, which increases in all the scenarios. And then we also observe reduction in dairy, eggs, and sugars. So we are also able to complementarily analyze the effects of Eat Lancet dietary recommendations on water use, GHG emissions as well. Again, I'm unable to explain this figure here because of the time, but we are able to see the impacts of implementations of these policies on reductions. So overall, in the water modeling analysis for India, which is still work in progress, we see that energy prices can be increased to some extent without much adverse effects, which is the cost 1 cent scenario that I look at. And then spatial targeting of physical restrictions may offer benefits. And then there's this whole short and long run implications of either of these two policies. So it's depending on the policy priorities, more evidence can be generated on which policy offers better outcomes in both the short and the long runs. So yeah, that is it from my end. Thank you.
Thank you, Vartika, for sharing your presentation. I would now like to invite Dr. Nicole Strato de Perez, who is a research fellow at the International Food Policy Research Institute. He'll speak with us today on stimulating subsidy and trade reforms in India. Over to you, Dr. Nicole Strato.
Can you see my slide now?
Yes, we can see it. Thank you.
Okay, the title is Simulating Subsidy and Trade Reforms in Asia. Specifically, the objective is for sustainability and efficiency of food system. I'm just the presenter here and part of the team for this research. I would like to dive in right away to the net effects of government support to the agriculture sector. As you can see, these are historical series that includes producer support estimates and consumer support estimates. You can see different things here. Some of them are even into the single commodity support on both consumer and producer. But I would like you to note that take notice that the even in the rice single commodity transfer or support, you will see that despite the price support, you will notice that essentially the net effect are negative for rice and milk also. And on the consumer support estimate, you will see that consumer are really benefiting more than the producer. But I would like you also to focus on the support based on variable input use. There are three highlighted here: the irrigation subsidy, electricity subsidy, and fertilizer subsidy. I'll be focusing more on the later on the electricity subsidy because it has relationship with how we exploit the groundwater resources for irrigation. Okay, this is just a comparative analysis of the producer support estimates, consumer support estimates, and total support estimates for 5 group of countries, including India. And what you will notice is that, the yellow one, this is India, and then comparatively, they are on opposite direction with China, and also on this consumer support estimate also. So, but you will notice that both of them are really, the producer are really on the negative side in terms of percentage support, and then positive on the consumer support. On the net total support estimate, they are changing, but has been on the negative side earlier, but now it's leveling into almost equating the effect of both consumer and producer support. And this is just another way of looking at it. You have the irrigation subsidy, electricity subsidy, fertilizer subsidy, and other input use subsidy. Again, I will be focusing a little bit on the electricity subsidy, at least in this presentation. And you will see that there's also a big chunk of subsidy for electricity in agriculture. And this is now just the import tariff rates. It does not include everything because it doesn't include the implicit effect of quantitative restriction on both import and export side. But also, I just want you to note that the NPC, the nominal protection coefficient for producers, actually less than 1, so 0.94 in 2020, and the NPC for consumers is also below 85, A1 point below 1. it's 0.85. And I will put that into consideration in our modeling exercises. Again, the point, we're trying to model the one subsidy, which is electricity for agriculture, and also the import and export tariff. This one shows the groundwater resources in the country. The shaded areas, that is the entire country of India, and you will note that the different colors, these are the different watersheds. There's a lot of watersheds. I just summarize it here, but I have a more detailed data by watershed, and what it shows is that almost in all watershed, groundwater is being depleted at the rate of 114%. This is how I define the depletion. We define sustainability in groundwater resources use by equating it, or by not exceeding it beyond the water recharge rate. So we don't know how much water do we have there on our groundwater, but we want to make sure that we are not over extracting beyond the recharge capacity. And this is one of our scenarios that we're going to analyze. So here are the simulation scenarios that we're trying to simulate. There are two climate scenarios. One would be the no climate change scenarios. Actually, this is a counterfactual scenario because we know that climate change is our baseline. Our climate change scenario, we're using three models, GFDL, HAGEM, and IPSL under 8.5 RCPs and SSP2. And that projects three set of temperature and precipitation and evapotranspiration patterns to 2050. We also try to simulate sustainability and efficiency policy scenarios. Again, I would like to at least define the water conservation scenario, wherein we try to have a sustainable level of groundwater extraction for agriculture. Again, the definition is by not exceeding the recharge rate. So we're doing this staggeredly. We're using the extraction starting 2022 to 2025, at least in our setup, to the rate of recharge net of environmental flow, and includes the elimination or reduction of subsidy on electricity for agriculture to lower the groundwater extraction to this sustainable level. And then for the efficiency policy scenario, we would like to focus on the more liberalized trade scenario, justifying this trade. This is more like free trade. And I know there are some cases that, especially in this crisis thing, there are a lot of restriction put in trade, but we'll just like to put in our scenario that trade would be more free and liberalized. And then, of course, the combined effect of two. They might be each might be going the different directions. So we'll see the net effect of both groundwater conservation and free trade, liberalized trade. Using this bioeconomic modeling framework, this is a simplified illustration of the impact model, but the basic structure will be the same. You have like biophysical models, we have climate models, water models, and the crop models. And the economic models, we have a multi-market model of supply, demand, and trade. And again, this is your basic food demand and food supply and excess demand in terms of trade locally and internationally. And here's the result. We'll go to the result right away. The result shows that in terms of production and trade, you will notice that diseases, the climate change will really result in declining production, both almost in all commodities, compared to the counterfactual of no climate change. And if you go to the groundwater conservation, what happens here is that you will be using less water, or at least less electricity, and also it means less water for irrigation, and it could effectively even reduce your irrigated area. So the net effect is mostly on the cereals. We'll see some reduction in cereals, not much on the meat products, but basically on cereals. Yeah, and of course in some other commodities that uses groundwater. Trade. Oh, this is the trade scenario, liberalization, and then I will see that there will be increase. Yeah, there will be increasing production. I have noted earlier that the NPC is less than 1 for producer, and this is what is happening. When it's liberalized, production is actually enhanced. And then the combined effect, yes, it's almost similar with just additive effect of groundwater conservation and trade. Now trade, this is net trade, and what happens here is that it compensates for any increase or loss or decline in production. So you will see in some commodities, import. The negative ones are net imports. The positive one are export. Let me continue right away. This is the same. Data presented differently, so that you can see it virtually. That I mean, in the figure that all cereals are really increasing, declining with climate change. Production are declining, but with trade liberalization, cereals are really increasing. Most of them are, and both, with groundwater conservation and trade, most of them are a little bit higher, but so it depends on commodities, but this is the same as the previous table, at least in presentation. And also, again, this is the same data set, but now in graphical form. So the negative would be net import, and the positive are net export. Now, one of the positive, at least characteristic of the Eat Lancet diet is that it is based on sustainable and efficient production system, and that's what we try to do here. Try to have a sustainable use of groundwater resources, and also try to be more efficient in terms of in our trade, which most of the time are distortionary. So we are now comparing it with the Eat Lancet diet, and some of the analysis have been done with comparison with Eat Lancet diet is that it's compared with the the current 2020 diet. But as if you read the report, it's actually the comparison should be in 2020, 2050, and this is what we are doing here. And you will know that climate change would really reduce the per capita consumption of most, if not all, commodities. And it will be, if you look at the deviations, I define the deviations into two components. The horizontal deviation, this is comparison example for the whole grains. You compare the Lancet diet with the either 2020 diet or 2050 diet, but this is the comparison, the horizontal. Then you add all the deviation, sum of square deviation, and you will have the horizontal deviation. The vertical deviation is more on the how each item here is compared to the total structure vertically. So, for example, whole grains would be how many percent of the entire diet, and compare it to this. How many percent would this be compared to the total diet? And that's where you can get the vertical deviation. I just add all the two of them to come up with the total deviation. The smaller the deviation, that means the nearer it would be to the Eat Lancet diet. And you will notice that our scenario, the groundwater, the trade, and the combination are really deviating away from the Eat diet in terms of magnitude, and also in terms of per capita consumption per day. And you will notice that basically in the future you will be consuming more than in terms of grams per capita. People would be consuming more than the Eat Lancet diet. Now, however, in terms of a welfare implication, we also analyze the welfare effect of this scenario. Climate change will really have negative impact on both producer and consumer surpluses, both of them, to the tune of $11 billion per year in the next 25 years. And groundwater will there will be groundwater conservation will have an effect also of reducing production, and would affect negatively also on the both welfare of producer and consumer. However, the trade liberalization would have a net effect, positive effect on the entire economy, and even would be gaining like almost 50 billion per year. And also, the other one, the combination would be also have an annualized value of 7 for the whole economy. But on both cases, producer will be losing compared to the consumers who are benefiting from this last two scenarios. Now, in terms of resources utilization, we oftentimes equate it with sustainability when there are some crop area saved or irrigation water saved, and this is how it is showing. So with the trade liberalization and groundwater conservation, trade liberalization, and the combination, you'll be using less land, but more so for the combination of groundwater conservation and trade liberalization.
Nicholas,
and also, yes.
Can you please try to wrap up past time?
Yeah.
Thank
Actually, this is the last couple of, I have a couple of last slide, and yeah, but you will be saving water also here. Not much from the livestock. Okay, conclusion. Okay, groundwater scenario sets groundwater exploitation down to sustainable levels, which move India closer to the eat diet landscape, save irrigation water, but incur welfare losses to both producers and consumer. The trade scenario moves the diet farthest from the eat landscape diet, but accrues the highest benefits to consumers and society, and save huge crop area and irrigation water. And then these are just a few recommendations, which include combination of, we should have some combination of government support, and should be part of the, at least our target of having regional Indian planetary health diets. And I also want to explore more the possibility of repurposing, because in this case, we did not repurpose all the subsidies. We just sort of reduce or eliminate them. And then another, this is the distortionary government support or subsidy. It will to further enhance sustainability and efficiency. Again, we focus also on the supply side approach of improved production practices, and reducing food losses and waste should be given further attention in terms of research and development. And also, I also recommend to have focus more on the demand side approach in terms of trying to approach the planetary health diet to complement the supply side approach that we have used. And then let's try to develop better estimates of current and evolving Indian diet. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Perez, for your presentation. I would now like to remind the participants again that we have a discussion at the end of the session. And if you have any questions, to please post in the Q&A box, and the chairperson will take it up during the discussion session. I would now like to turn to Dr. Aditi Mukherjee, Principal Researcher, International Water Management Institute, and Coordinator, Lead Author, IPCCAR6. She will speak on assessing the water futures, reflections on the IPCC process. Over to you, Dr. Mukherjee.
Thank you so much. Let me share my presentation. Right, just give me a minute. Do you see the presentation?
Dr. Mukherjee, I see the presentation now. Yes, it's on full slide.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. So I just also included, given I was listening with great interest to all the presentations in this session, and given that I also included the word food in this. And I think my brief today that I received from Avinash was, or the way I interpreted the brief was not as much to present the particular findings from the IPCC, but rather to look at the processes and set the ground for, is there any scope or opportunity for a regional assessment of the agri-food system for South Asia, for example. So what do these assessments, comprehensive assessments, entail? What have some of the other models done? So given that background, I'm going to present some of my own understanding of how the IPCC process works and some of the other processes that have used that IPCC, one IPCC being Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So I think the question that all of us and many of the presentations this morning were about was, how do we assess the past, present, and future of food and water systems, or in other words, agri-food systems in our region, in ways that are scientific, rigorous, traceable, because we are, at the end of the day, scientific organization interested in understanding our future in a way that is basically scientific. But then we also understand that water food system, water land food systems, agri-food systems are inherently interdisciplinary. There is not one discipline that has a total handle on it. So these assessments also have to be very interdisciplinary. they have to include various voices, including that of indigenous local knowledge, because again, this is more like transdisciplinary angle of it, because there is work beyond the scientist and the scientific community, quote unquote, scientist and scientific community. And these include indigenous knowledge, work of the civil society, work by the private sector who are also working in this domain, and they may not always publish papers in peer-reviewed journals, but those are also equally important perspectives. Then I think one of the attempts is always to be policy relevant, but not necessarily policy prescriptive, knowing that the governments tend to be more sensitive when you are trying to provide them with policy prescription. So in my mind, these are the four main challenges that any comprehensive assessment has. It has to be scientific, interdisciplinary, it has to have some way of including other transdisciplinary voices, and has to be policy relevant. So, and this is something that has been, so there are various models of such global and regional assessment exist. Of the two that I'm particularly familiar with, having been parts of these two assessments, is something that I will be presenting today, mostly the process or my knowledge of the process. Again, I may not know everything that goes into it, but I'll try my best depending on what I know. So the first is the IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. This time's IPCC, this IPCC is in its sixth cycle, is called the Assessment Report 6 cycle. Around over 800 scientists chosen by the IPCC Bureau as lead authors. Review editors were involved in the cycle. The cycle is almost nearing its end. We have only one product, the synthesis report, that's due and will come later in this year. Additional 3,000 or so scientists have contributed as contributing authors. They are not necessarily appointed by the IPCC, but the various chapters go out and look for those missing expertise. Again, given that there is just such a huge amount of knowledge that's out there, that is not possible for a group of 10 or 12 authors to comprehensively assess such knowledge. So there is a lot of contributing authors that the author teams rope in their work. Then several thousands of scientists act as expert reviewers. IPCC sends these reports for open public review, and several hundreds and thousands of scientists put in their comments in that, and the IPCC authors have to then respond to each and every comment. The overall is it assesses published peer-reviewed knowledge, and this time there was also some extra effort to include knowledge generated through indigenous people. It was either through inclusion of indigenous knowledge holders as authors, but also encouraging those indigenous knowledge holders to actually write up those assessments as independent assessments. So there was a methodology paper of how to include those indigenous knowledge. And I'm also aware IP-Best, where some of you may be involved, also does a similar global process. The other one that I can briefly talk about is the ECMOD, Intergovernmental International Center for Integrated Mountain Development, based in Nepal. They recently did an Himalayan Hindu Kush assessment. Again, a similar model, 300 scientists, published as open access. Before this, I'm aware of at least EMI had done something called a comprehensive assessment of water and food. This was an 8-volume report using very similar methods. Then very recently, IITM Pune, Institute of Tropical Meteorology, Pune, concluded an IPCC-style climate change assessment, but they only did the physical sciences and not the adaptation and the mitigation part. So as I said, there are lots of these assessments going on, and they bring a huge amount of value simply because of the sheer volume of literature that we have on various issues. Just to explain the IPCC model of assessment, I am sure many of you are aware of all of this, but just to show that IPCC was jointly established by WMO and UNEP way back in 1988, and since then it is into the 6th assessment cycle. The first assessment report was in 1990, then followed by the second, third, the 4th assessment report was in 2007. I know Pramod was involved in this one because I have seen this Nobel Peace Prize plaque in your room, Pramod, one of these. I think I still remember that. And AR5 was the one that happened in 2013-14, the cycle before that, and that really influenced the formulation of the Paris Agreement. And this report is supposed to give input to the global stocktake on adaptation and climate action that is scheduled in 2023. So that's kind of, so overall, these IPCC reports, as most of us know, have been quite influential, especially they're being used widely during the COP negotiations. And they have influenced many of these climate agreements. Overall, the role of IPCC is to assess comprehensive, objective, open, transparent basis, the scientific, technical, and socioeconomic information relevant to climate change. So our brief as authors is that this report should be neutral with respect to policy. And while, so basically the term that they use is be policy relevant, but not policy prescriptive. I think that's something that's been, we have to very carefully tread that thin line between being policy prescriptive versus relevant. So the process is really long from the time we get recruited as authors to the time, well, by the way, all of it is voluntary. I mean, often organization support for me, some of my staff time was supported by IMI, but IPCC does not pay its authors. So all our time is on a voluntary basis, the contribution. So it's actually quite a long process from the time, at least when authors get involved, and authors get involved in basically the step 4, from the time the authors get involved to the time of the publication of the report, it takes up to 2 to 3 years. This time it took us all completely 3 years, partly because of the pandemic pushed the timelines by 5 to 6 months. So the process starts with the scoping, which is done by the governments involved in the IPCC Bureau. So they actually provide a bulleted scope of what the report will look like, what kind of special reports are being asked for by the governments. Then that is again in some other IPCC meetings, which I believe 178 or 180, all the countries of UNFCCC are part of it. All the governments actually approve those outline, and outlines are just like bullet points. This is followed by nomination of authors. I'll come to that in a little while. Selection of authors is again done by the IPCC. And once the authors are selected, then there are usually 4 face-to-face meetings, but the work continues offline, online. I mean, basically all those 3 years, it's quite a lot of intense work. So the first draft goes out for a first order review. Actually, there's one before step, again, another step called internal review, when it goes only to selected reviewers. But overall, then the first order draft goes on for expert review. Those expert reviews comes, and we have to respond to them and write the second draft. Then the second draft actually then goes out to the government review, also apart from expert scientist review. Based on this, we have to revise and then write also the summary for policymakers, which then is the governments then review the final draft of the summary for policymakers. So there is often a misconception I have seen that the IPCC reports are not quite scientific because the governments intervene. I think that's not correct. The governments, yes, the governments co-produce the report along with the authors and the IPCC leadership, but that's only the summary for policymakers. All the rest of the summary products, like the technical summary as well as the individual chapters, are not like directly influenced by the governments. Of course, they give comments and we have to respond to those comments, but the scientists hold the pen in all of those regards, while the SPM, there is a co-production process that happens. Then that SPM goes through an approval of the report. This time it happened online, but usually it's face-to-face, and it was a 2 weeks of pretty grueling, where each and every sentence is read and approved by each of the governments, which also means that it then becomes a pretty powerful document, given that it has been co-produced by the government themselves, finally followed by publication of the report. So this entire cycle runs for 7 years, while for the authors are involved for 2 to 3 years in the actual production of the report. Selection process and nomination, I thought that what's important, and also for this particular, what the presentations I've been listening to, is that there's been a lot of issues around representation matters, because yeah, I mean, these are just such complex issues that nobody holds the key to any one of these. So everybody who is impacted in one way or the other has to be involved. So the nomination happens as countries and other nominating agencies. For example, CG has a nominating right, as far as I understand. And they all nominate the authors. There's a small form that authors can put in. In other countries, it's like different countries do it differently, and in some countries authors can directly get in touch with their nodal person and nominate themselves, but I believe different countries follow a different role, and then all these nominations go to the bureau who choose from them. And this time they were quite, I think there has been in the past quite a lot of critique of the IPCC process. It was thought to be a global north dominated process, etc., and not enough global south voices. So I thought, so this AR6 had set itself quite a lot of targets around equitable representation. For example, AR5 had 79% men and 21% female. AR6 was different. This time there were 41% women authors in working group 2. It was a little less in working group 1 actually, but the working group 2 had quite a lot of 40% representation. Similarly, for developing countries, it went up from 35% to 47% authors from developing countries. And then this time they also included a lot of people who were new to the IPCC process. So there has been a lot of focus on diversity and representation. I won't go too much into it, but there are lots of products that this cycle of the IPCC produced. Some of the main products being the Global Warming Report, 1.5 degree report, which was quite influential in the current discourse that we see around 1.5 degree has been heavily influenced by this report that came out in 2018. It was also one of the more interdisciplinary kind of reports. Then there was another one around oceans and cryosphere. I was involved partly in that as well. Then another special report on land. These were all special reports where all the working groups worked. Then we had 3 reports. One was on physical basis of climate change, that's working group 1. That's another one on climate change impacts, adaptation, vulnerability, working group 2, and mitigation of climate change, that's working group 3. These reports were published from August 2021 till April 2022, and now the final synthesis report is awaited, which basically has the task of synthesizing all of these. In addition, there were some additional conferences, and these meetings also happen to decide what will be the special reports in the next cycle. Just briefly, some of the major findings, and this is all based on published literature. So this simple map, I would guess, would have been produced by reading and scanning thousands of relevant papers. Those papers would be assessed on the terms of their methodology, their quality, and what they did was also, I mean, this is I particularly like this representation because they have kind of provided a stylized map of the world that gets rid of many of the border issues that we often get in international context. And what it is really saying is that hot extremes are increasing in almost all regions. So at least in 41 regions out of the total assessed regions, the literature showed that there was an increase in hot extremes, and the confidence for something like that in South Asia region, this particular region, is very high, which also means that that's the way the scientists, so there is a set criteria of how you assess the literature, and of course it depends on the kind of literature you have, but confidence language in IPCC term is very important. Almost every finding comes with a confidence language. So for the context of South Asia here, it would be that it's a high confidence that hot extremes in South Asia have increased since the 1950s. Similarly, we have changes in heavy precipitation. Here it would be there is low confidence due to limited agreement that there has been changes in heavy precipitation, increase in heavy precipitation since 1950s, and that's also partly because of the nature of the data and how long the data is available, etc., etc. And there is also a similar graph for the droughts. On the droughts, particularly for the regional level in the region, we do not have we have a low agreement in the type of change. So that those are some of the more physical based findings. Similar findings also for the future for different now. One of the things is a lot of this uses CMIP6 data, and there's a move towards, like earlier, from the RCPs to more of global warming, because this is what is more policy relevant given those Paris targets. So these simulations, these projections are really showing what will happen to annual mean temperature, mean precipitation, or soil moisture change at different levels of global warming. And these are often also ensemble of various of hundreds of models fit. And so that's like that's the way the projections are done. But that's not only the physical projections. A working group too, within which I was involved, does a lot of you have to let me know if I'm running out of time, so I'll hurry up. So this is something that we did as a part of the working group too, where our main job was to assess the effectiveness of adaptation. Is adaptation reducing climate risk? And unlike the climate models and the simulations, there aren't any global models that looks at adaptation, knowing that adaptation is necessarily a very local phenomena. What we instead had was thousands and thousands of published articles that looks at adaptation and its various aspects. So there was a large initiative called GAMI, Global Adaptation Mapping Initiative, partly done with IPCC authors and partly also independently, that had collated all possible articles on adaptation from the last cycle, from like basically 2014 to 2020. And the water chapter that I was involved in, we looked at the database and we zoomed in on a certain number of articles, 359, that had actually some measures of that outcome, because not all adaptation literature, as you know, is very qualitative. They always do not necessarily look at outcomes. So we zeroed in on a certain number of articles which is actually measuring outcomes of adaptation, because our question really was, is adaptation effective in reducing climate risk? So we were able to involve a lot of early career researchers in the coding. The protocol development was done by the author team. And this is, by the way, this entire analysis just got maybe, I don't know, 5-6 pages of our entire chapter, and our chapter is 60 pages long. So this is just a tiny part of the overall assessment. Similar assessments have been done for every single aspect, but I just am highlighting the adaptation part of it because this may be somewhat new. So a lot of people were involved in coding. All of them ended up becoming contributing authors. Their names appear in the chapter. And what we find was that water is absolutely central to adaptation, and more than 60% of all adaptation are happening due to either drought, precipitation variability, but also floods, soil erosion, groundwater. So basically, majority of the adaptation, at least 60%, are responding to water-related hazards. And we also categorized adaptation types, responses into these 16 categories of adaptation based on the literature. We found that most of the adaptation is happening in the agriculture sector, not surprising given it is the most climate exposed sector that there is right now. We also found that adaptation is happening, these are documented cases, by no way are these comprehensive, because many adaptation may not be even written up as journal articles. So based on those documented cases, we found that a lot of those documented cases actually comes from Africa and Asia, again, around agriculture. That also shows that the focus on climate and adaptation is in these countries. We may have missed quite a lot of literature in Latin America because of Spanish. We did try, but I don't think we were as successful as we were in curating English language literature. Some additional findings about the role. Majority of the adaptation has been done by individuals and households, and relatively little contribution from profit-making private sector, which is a bit of concern because of the way I keep hearing about the role that private sector can play in climate action, but there isn't a lot of evidence that they're playing that role yet. So something to think about. But this could be also an artifact of the kind of results we publish. Possibly the CSR kind of funds never get written up and published as peer review. So those are all the ones. I won't go too much into the findings, but this is where we have actually said, we have actually also evaluated these studies on whether they were effective in reducing climate risks. And our conclusion was that the way the studies have been framed and documented, it is very difficult to say if there, we found that adaptation has many benefits and many axes, such as livelihoods, economy, financial benefits, environmental benefits, but whether or not the reduced climate risk now and for the future is something we were not able to assess based on the literature. So this, we think, is something that needs to be done more carefully for the next assessment. Then we also did.
Aditi, sorry to interrupt. Could you just try to conclude now?
Okay, I will. So similarly, we found that adaptation becomes less effective at higher levels of global warming. So I'll stop there. We did a similar assessment for the HKH, which also involved around 350 people, Himalayan Hindu Kush assessment, which followed very much the IPCC model. Similar findings, I saw earlier a question on Himalayas, the findings, and this is also something reflected in the IPCC. In a 1.5 degree world, glaciers in the region will lose 36% of the volume. At a 2 degree world, we are projected to lose almost 50% of the ice volume, and this would have several impacts, which I will not go through. This is one photo. So I'll just stop there and thank you so much. And thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mukherjee. Thanks for the elaborate presentation. I would now like to invite the chairperson, Dr. Pramod Agarwal, to give his remarks and post his remarks to open the session for discussion. Over to you, Dr. Agarwal.
Thank you, Rebecca, and thank you all the panelists for such a distinguished presentation. It was really phenomenal, a lot of information. In fact, to be honest, I have some information overload right now, still trying to digest such richness of data and points that were raised. Overall, what I felt that the topic covered very well, the session covered very well, the interactions between food, environment, resource use, trade, and policies. I must admit that it was not really easy to understand all of you in such a short time because of the richness of your analysis. One concern and maybe one point that I would like to drive and request your support, all the speakers, if you could just simplify and make one statement, key statement for general public or policymakers who don't understand the economics jargon that you have used a lot, like demand, supply, trade policies, this model, that model. If you could simplify, for example, David, I am sorry that we have to keep you still awake. It's fairly late for three of you in the IFPRI headquarters, but since you have stayed awake so long, maybe another 5-10 minutes will not matter so much, hopefully. David, you made excellent presentation about implications of trade, export ban and imports and so on and so forth, and links with climate, but not so obvious links in climate. For example, you said about wheat, it's a fairly debated topic about wheat import and export here, and you rightly or wrongly labeled India as an unreliable trading partner. I'm not too sure if you use that many words, but I think your successors highlighted that. I'm just curious, do you have examples where a country which suffers deficits and who has been a traditional exporter continues to export when there is domestic demand and domestic deficit? Are there any examples, good examples like that? David?
Yes, thanks for the great question. I will say yes. If you take the example of the US, the US had a few times in their history put some export restriction. One actually was against India for geopolitical reason at one point in time, and that has been translated in, I think, a traumatic experience for India that say you cannot rely on a country like this. But also they did it on soybean. And the consequences was for Japan and Europe to invest in Latin America. So you have countries that learn that if you want to really use your comparative advantage and use your potential, you have to become reliable partners and always weight the short-term pressure and gains to the longer one. The other aspect of it is when you put this export ban, in many cases, you are hurting your farmers. I'm not in India, but 3 months ago, I was reading a lot of newspapers saying farmers were pretty happy because they will sell at a very good price this year. They will not have to sell to the government. Commercial business was good. And now when you put export ban, you basically say no more commercial things. Government will take care of everything. So you undermine your farmers. And that's also what we see in Argentina. So that's where I say I understand the concern on food security, especially for the urban population. But for me, the response is social safety net. And that's what we have seen actually in many countries. And still value your agricultural production, still generate income for your farmers to strengthen your things. So that will be the balance. And we have seen some countries doing it. Now, it depends where you are at which time and what government you have and what money you have available. So sometimes there is a money constraint that we have to acknowledge, especially in low and middle income countries. But there is a solution. And export ban on the long term has rarely or never, I would say, pay off.
Yeah, perfect. We can continue discussing this, but since we have very limited time, I just have one more clarification on the environmental linkages, and especially about biofuels. I think you made a recommendation that we should not put that many restrictions on biofuel usage. Well, what sort of environmental implications your recommendation would have in terms of water use, in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, in case we try to reduce biofuels?
So the issue is that, all biofuels are not equal. So sometimes we have to be careful. For example, making ethanol from sugarcane can be environmentally and economically viable, but making biodiesel with palm oil, for instance, or most of the oil seed is pretty bad. So just we have to acknowledge this. Now, the key thing is, if we want to decarbonize transportation, and first of all, car and trucks, biofuel is not even a medium-term strategy. We need basically to electrify this transportation. And we still need to use fossil fuel in planes, and I think it will take time. Then for maritime transportation is different, but I really think that we need to prioritize and to say, if we want to remove fossil fuel for a part of the economy, and this part is what we put in cars, the pathway is electrification. It's now trying to replace all gasoline with new gasoline like we were thinking 100 years ago. Yes, most of the first generation biofuel and ethanol are based on technology that are more than 100 years old, and the world can do better than that. And moreover, in terms of even of atmospheric pollution, electric car, as soon as electricity is based on renewable, of course, I'm not arguing about electrification based on coal plants, that will be the most bigger picture. So see that we have to see the bigger picture and say, where do we need biomass and where we need other things to achieve our goals.
Thank you, David. Let me move on. Just one or two more points, but let me put the spotlight on the three speakers, the three subsequent speakers, Devesh, Nikos, and Vartika. All three of you highlighted about Eat Lancet diet. I think this has created quite a good amount of ripples all around, and everybody seems to be talking about it. What was also interesting is that you raised the linkage between agriculture, nutrition, and climate. Of course, I really didn't get the feel of climate part so much. It's both ways that you see here in terms of climate and resource use. So what's the take-home message? Should we go for Eat Lancet diets or not? It's somewhat confusing. And honestly, I really couldn't comprehend what all three of you were trying to say. Should we go for it today? Should we go for it in 2050? Nikos made some presentation about 2050 scenarios as well. Vartika talked in relation to groundwater, and I think Devesh also touched upon this. So I'm really curious, in developing countries, global South, India, East India, should we be aiming for Eat Lancet diet? And what sort of environmental implications it will have? Any one of you, please.
Let me start. It has. I think we should go for the Eat Lancet diet, but it has to be global. Global. I mean, everyone should be targeting for it, because this is it has a supply and even price implication. Because the usual comment is that this is expensive, but if you direct your production globally, I mean, all of you would be focusing on this type of food items. At least the variations within the nutrients or composition. I believe that prices will go down, and they can be both healthy for the environment and also for everyone. Of course, there will be some regional variation because especially in India, especially in India, that we already does not really follow the pathway of Eat Lancet diet, where you need to increase fruit and vegetables. India is already eating a lot of fruits and vegetables. Yeah, but the idea, I think, is whether if you're going to go for it, I think we should have a cooperation globally, so that prices will also go down, and also we'll have more sustainable. I mean, if you have a uniform technology and productivity around the world, it will have a big impact in terms of production technology and also prices.
So, Nicholas, if I could quickly interrupt, and please give me a very short answer, we're running out of time. Well, you're talking of a global agreement, everybody should move towards that. But we know, it's not an easy job. It's not an easy target. And today we are focusing on Eastern Gangetic Plains. So just from the perspective of Eastern Gangetic Plains, for a minute, you try to isolate this region from the rest of the world. Should Eastern Gangetic Plain be going for Eat Lancet diets? Whether they can afford it, and what sort of environmental implications it will have?
Yeah, it's more for this region. I think we should go more for meat products, which is not traditionally the case. But yeah, I think if we want to go near the Eat Lancet diet, it would be increasing more in terms of production and consumption of meat and animal products.
Okay, let's also hear from Devesh and Vartika. Any remarks on this?
So, so Dr. Agarwal, this is, Eat Lancet is based on planetary boundaries, right? It's not based on national boundaries. And we actually worked on comparing, Avinash is also part of the paper that we did, which is also comparing the Indian diet to the Eat Lancet diet. And it's the same logic that when it comes to, say, greenhouse gas emissions, you say, all of you have polluted and now it's our turn, and then, you put some restriction. So the same logic would work in terms of, say, what are you going to be your dietary patterns? Because, we are so far from the frontier when it comes to animal source food consumption. And, if you want to move all towards vegetarian diet, I mean, that could not be, from a larger perspective, would be tenable. So going back to just to answer in short, going back to your question, should we be striving for Eat Lancet diet? My point was that, I'm not even sure that Eat Lancet is the epitome of the standard that one should be targeting. I mean, that would be very context specific, could be very time specific. And you have to take into account the regional specificity when you do this, what should be your kind of ideal diet.
Right, perfect. Vartika, quickly, and Aditi as well.
Thank you. Yes, not much to add beyond what Devesh and Nicholas have added, just that we don't have to look at Eat Lancet in its entirety. We have to look at it in parts and in terms of food groups. So most certainly in the Eastern Gangetic Plains, we need to reduce the consumption of cereals overall, because they at present constitute about 70% of your plate. So it needs to be reduced to 50%. And then we need to increase the consumption of pulses or proteins, as you can say. So EAT-Lancet suggests reduction in animal-based proteins and increase in plant-based proteins. But as Devesh said, we are already much below the frontier in India. So a healthy mix of both meat and plant-based proteins for India, and then fruits and vegetables. So yes, and reduction in sugars. Certainly, India is consuming a whole lot of sugars that we need to reduce. Yeah.
Implications on groundwater.
Much so, not just the food, as we show in one of our papers, not just just by itself, it will not have implications on water use reduction, but complementary policies that also affect climate change reduction. So biofuel policies for that matter, as well as focus on crop production, will have significant implications for water use going down. Yeah.
Thank you. Aditi, any last comments from you, Aditi? Are you still there?
Not really, except to say that this is an important research question we are trying to answer in TAFSA. What is that regionally appropriate diets, and what would be the implications on quote unquote planetary boundaries? So I was happy to hear from the various panelists, and we would look up all your studies. LHSTM has done some interesting work that shows that you can potentially reduce your water consumption by growing crops which are more nutrient rich, and also add to the diet. So this is something we hope to do more systematically as a part of TAFSA that Avinash was mentioning early on. So this is one of the major work streams that we are hoping to tackle in TAFSA. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I realize that I have taken much of the discussion time, so I will stop here, although I have lots of questions generated by your excellent presentations, all 5 of you. But let's look at the chat box. I think there are some questions for some of you. I think there's one question for Devesh pending for quite some time. But Devesh, 2 of the principles of Nexus approach are framework should determine trade-offs and synergy, and second, provide a tool to achieve SDGs. I might have missed these aspects in the presentation. Will appreciate getting more specific findings of your study. Any response? I noticed that you're typing an answer, but perhaps you could just quickly say something about it.
Yeah, so no, thanks. I was just actually typing the answer to that question when you just came, because so basically the framework that we really presented, maybe it didn't come out very clearly in terms of what we want to do in the framework. Is about these trade-offs. That if you do intervene on the climate side, that would have economic implication, that would have the social linkages in terms of so and then we talk about and then all these are based in what we call about these trade-offs that in an enabling environment, what we call, which is where your external environment, the domestic policies all come in. And so the framework that we presented was exactly about those trade-offs. I mean, so and what are the specific trade-offs? I mean, very granular level. That's what we really discuss in part of our work, which is looking at this nexus. Is that specifically that what are the really elements of those trade-offs, right? Just like it's very short, time is short. So I'll just give you an example that if you look at just when we talked about the size, scale, composition effect, that your economy grows, then there can be all these kind of effects that will determine the trade-offs in what will happen on poverty, what will happen on environment, what will happen on climate. So those are the things that we really want to emphasize in that framework.
Perfect. I noticed there was a few more questions, but these have been already answered live. So perhaps we need to stop here. But any panelists have any question for other panelists? Anything that you think is important and you would like to make a remark? Any one of you, please. Any question, comment on any other presentation that you heard during this session? If not, I think, I think most of us are hungry or sleepy, I suppose. So I will not take much more time. Thank you very much once again. This was an excellent session. A lot of learning for me. Of course, I would really like to touch base with many of you again. Lots of questions I had noted, lots of points for discussion further, but because of limited time, we cannot do it. But this topic of linking policies, trade, production, environment and resources is very critical. And I think a piecemeal understanding of that is often not adequate. So we really need to focus a lot. And I'm very happy to see practically everybody focusing to understand this interplay between different factors. So thank you very much, and back to the organizers.
Thank you, Dr. Agarwal.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Agarwal, for giving your comments and for enriching the discussions. So this brings us to the close of day 1 sessions, and I would like to thank you all for joining today. We look forward to meet you all virtually again tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. Indian Standard Time. Thank you all.
Can you give a big round of applause to all the presenters and the chair?
Sure.
There you go.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good day.
Thanks. Good night.